A long time ago, there was a famous blacksmith who owned a shop and crafted all his equipment by hand. His reputation grew when he began selling his creations to the kingdom of Cairo, which was embroiled in an endless war. This was the perfect opportunity for him to elevate his status, and when the conflict ended, the blacksmith was granted the title of Baron. This man became the owner of the lands and the father of young Master Roman, the protagonist of the story. We begin with an old man telling this tale to a seated boy, while a mustachioed man standing behind them wonders why the boy is paying so much attention to something everyone already knows. The story then flashes back a few hours. The young man, Roman, asks the mustached man if he is the eldest son of the Dimitri family, if they are in the kingdom of Cairo on the Salamander continent, and if the Murim world truly does not exist. The mustached man confirms this but thinks the young master has always been odd. However, today he seems completely out of his mind, perhaps due to the strange drugs becoming popular among the rich these days. The mustached man then mentions that a young lady from the Lawrence family is coming to visit. He reflects on how Roman has been wasting his life for the past 25 years, earning him the nickname the Dimitri family's trash. The man tries to explain the importance of the girl, but Roman interrupts him, saying there's something more urgent. He asks for the oldest person in the land to be brought to him because he needs to learn how to live in this world. The mustached man is bewildered, but as a servant he obeys. The story returns to the present. The old man finishes his tale, and Roman thanks him, offering a reward. The old man responds that it was an honor to speak with the young master. Roman, who now knows everyone calls him Roman Dimitri, realizes his true name is Baek Jung-hyuk. He comes from the Murim world, where he lived a life of endless wars, conquered everything he desired, and died in peace. However, for some reason, he has awakened in Roman's body. He doesn't know if it's heaven's will or punishment for refusing ascension. Suddenly, a noise is heard outside. A boy is kicked in the face, surrounded by thugs in front of a small shop, bleeding and unable to respond. The thugs call him a filthy bastard as they mercilessly beat him. Dimitri's servant approaches to see what's happening and is shocked to recognize the red fang tattoo on the thugs. Roman, hearing the commotion, orders his servant, Hans, to explain quickly. Hans reveals that the attackers are from the Blood Fangs, a group infamous not just in Dimitri's territory but also in the surrounding regions. It appears the boy owes them something. Hans urges Roman not to get involved, fearing the trouble it will bring, but Roman has already approached the thugs. A bald man among them recognizes Roman and mocks him, warning him not to meddle just because of his noble status. Hans pleads with Roman not to interfere, as they'll gain nothing by going against the Blood Fangs. But Roman calmly asks Hans to explain the rules, who broke them, and who should be punished. Hans hesitates but admits that while the boy is guilty for not repaying his debt, the Blood Fangs had no authority to punish him in this manner. Worse, they disrespected the eldest son of the Dimitri family, a crime punishable by death. The thugs stare in disbelief as Hans reveals this. Roman picks up a stick from the ground and declares that, as the eldest son of the Dimitri family, he must punish them all. The bald man tries to reason with Roman, claiming he doesn't understand how the world works. He points to their tattoos, warning Roman not to make things worse. Roman, unimpressed, says that this only proves what he wanted to know. They are nothing but trash if they speak this way about the lord of the land. Without hesitation, Roman plunges the stick into the bald man's neck, stunning everyone. As Roman turns to the other thugs, they curse him, vowing revenge. Hans warns Roman to be cautious, noting that the thugs are far better armed than he is. But Roman easily dodges their attacks, landing a swift kick to one thug's shin and following up with a punch to his face. Hans is bewildered. He had no idea the young master could fight like this. Hans recalls how Roman's life was in ruins. The first thing Roman had seen when he woke up in this body was a farewell letter on the floor and scattered drugs. Roman had been chosen as his family's representative in Cairo's army, but he chose to take his own life instead. Baek Jung-hyuk reflects on how pathetic Roman's life was, regardless of his hardships. But now, as the leader of the celestial demon sect, Baek Jung-hyuk, who now occupies Roman's body, vows to live life on his terms. With just a stick, Roman paints the town red. Behind him, someone calls him a monster. One of the last remaining Blood Fangs tries to flee, but Roman grabs him by the hair, slams him to the ground, and declares that the law must be obeyed. He spares the thug, warning that he will live as an example of what happens when the law is broken. Roman gathers the townspeople and declares his name, Roman Dimitri. He tells them that if anyone has a problem with how he handled the situation, they are welcome to confront him anytime. Baek Jung-hyuk had reached the pinnacle of the Mirim world with incomparable strength. Hundreds of thousands of martial artists were defeated and massacred by him. When the blood of his enemies formed rivers, everyone recognized that the celestial demon sect now controlled the Mirim world. However, at this moment, he found himself struggling just to deal with street rats. He calls for Hans and instructs him to notify the guards about everything that has happened happened and to have someone clean up the place. Han simply replies that he will take care of it immediately and runs off. Back, Jung-hyuk reflects on how weak and useless this body he inhabits is. He knows he must accelerate his efforts to gather information on how to strengthen himself. Just then, the boy he had saved earlier gets up and thanks him for saving his life. Jung-hyuk remembers the boy, who had been beaten earlier, but coldly tells him that what he did was not intended to help him. The blood fangs had broken the law and were punished, nothing more. He then warns the boy that if he wants to keep his tongue, he'll need to explain his situation. The boy, having just tried to express his gratitude, receives a threat instead. Trembling, the boy explains that his relatives had borrowed money from the blood fangs to purchase some land and start farming. They would have easily repaid the debt by selling their crops, but the blood fangs destroyed the crops so they couldn't pay back the loan. Later, the boy discovered that the blood fangs did this to blackmail his family and take his younger sister. The boy screams that the world isn't fair, saying that even though his family didn't have much, they never harmed anyone. The only thing he begs for now is for Jung-hyuk to save his sister. Jung-hyuk observes the boy's eyes, which remind him of the mad demon, one of the 4 superior kings, someone he had met in a place as wretched as this. He then asks the boy for his name. The boy replies, Kevin. With that, Jung-hyuk says he will look into the situation and take care of everything. The boy shouts his thanks, while Jung-hyuk senses that this boy will likely have a long relationship with him. The scene shifts to a carriage approaching. Inside, someone informs Miss Flora that they are nearing the Dimitri estate. The blonde woman sighs, saying she understands. It seems she will soon have to meet Roman Dimitri. A month earlier, someone had shouted in a castle, demanding to know why there was an arranged marriage with their family. Flora's father had tried to remind her that their lands were in terrible condition due to the ongoing war, but Flora remained confused. She questioned whether the marriage had really been decided in this way, and worst of all, it was with the Dimitris, a family of miners and blacksmiths. She had tried to explain something, but her father had interrupted, apologizing for being so pathetic. Back in the present, the man in the carriage announces that they've arrived. Flora had hoped that at least the marriage would be with the second son, who seemed to have a promising future, but even that hope was dashed because Roman himself had begged his father for her hand in marriage. She knew very well Roman's reputation for living a life of luxury and pleasure, and now she couldn't understand why they had drenched him in so much perfume. As she walks through the corridors, she thinks that no matter how much her father needs this marriage, she won't accept it and needs to make that clear. At that moment, she turns to Dimitri and says she wants him to forget about this marriage. Surprisingly, Dimitri responds that it's indeed a great idea. Flora is left utterly confused. Dimitri explains that he has thought better about the marriage and realized it's foolish for someone as amazing as her to marry the idiot of the Dimitri family. Flora is bewildered, wondering if he's being serious. Dimitri then tells her that something important has come up and he needs to speak with his father immediately. However, she stops him, asking why he's acting this way. She had heard that this marriage was only happening because he had begged his father for it, but now he's suddenly canceling it without hesitation. Dimitri simply asks if she really wants to marry him, and when she replies no, he says they no longer need to cause problems for each other and that he'll take care of everything. He reassures her that she doesn't need to worry because he will take full responsibility. Since people already call him the idiot of the Dimitri family, he doesn't mind being called the divorced one as well. Flora still can't understand why he seems so determined. Is this really the same idiot everyone talks about? The door then closes behind him, and from inside, she hears a heated argument. Someone yells, demanding to know why Dimitri is canceling the marriage. Dimitri calmly informs his father that he's just letting him know because he's already told the girl. His father calls him an idiot, pointing out that everyone already calls him the fool of the Dimitri family. Securing this marriage was supposed to guarantee noble status for their family. All Dimitri had to do was marry a beautiful girl he himself had begged for. Dimitri apologizes, but his father grabs something from the table and throws it at his head, demanding to know if an apology will fix the situation. His father then mentions that he had been planning to send Dimitri to the battlefield for 6 months, but now it seems inevitable. He asks if Dimitri has anything to say, but Dimitri simply replies that he has nothing to add. Frustrated, his father stands up and mentions that he heard Dimitri got involved with the blood fangs and even punished them, but he doesn't believe it. His father warns him that he can't go against that group and tells Dimitri that he'll have to deal with his problems on his own. His father won't help him. Dimitri remains silent, and his father expects him to kneel and beg, but Dimitri just says he understands and will handle everything himself. With that, Dimitri leaves the room, determined to resolve the situation on his own. Dimitri returns to see Flora and questions why she's still there. She warns him that going against the blood fangs could be dangerous. Nobles fear them, and they might kill him if they see him as a threat. She advises him to return to his father and beg for forgiveness, but Dimitri only asks why he would do such a thing. When she explains her reasons, Dimitri interrupts her, stating that it seems she really doesn't know her place. The scene shifts to a few hours earlier when Hans was dousing Dimitri with perfume, trying to mask the smell of blood. Dimitri, eager to take off his tight-fitting clothes, was uncomfortable, but Hans explained that this was the only way to show respect. Meanwhile, Dimitri was thinking about the arranged marriage. Still adjusting to this world, he realized that this marriage would only complicate his understanding of it. Hans suggested they go downstairs to handle the situation. Dimitri, believing the girl had done nothing against him, initially intended to end things with as little offense as possible. However, he soon realized that the girl had never planned to show him any respect in the first place, leaving him with no reason to do so either. Dimitri tells Flora that from his perspective she seems very arrogant. He finds it ridiculous for her to show concern now, especially when she hadn't considered any circumstances while trying to break off the marriage. When he told his father that he would take full responsibility for ending the engagement, it was then that Flora became anxious. Dimitri accuses her of trying to appear like a good person after putting him in this situation, but she needs to understand that at no point did she influence his decision. He tells her that they will now go their separate ways, each taking care of their own lives. He had informed his father about taking responsibility to prevent people from thinking this was a consequence of their breakup, and because he wanted no further involvement with her. This was the first and last time they would see each other. Later that same night, Dimitri's father is drinking with his mother, Johanna. His father confesses that, unfortunately, he had used violence against Roman again. After their family became nobles, he never wanted his son to go through that situation, yet he admits it happened again. Johanna tries to reassure him, saying it's all right and that their children have grown up healthy. However, the father acknowledges that he still doesn't understand why Roman is the way he is, especially since Roman was the only one who endured hard times with him. He is at a loss for how to handle him. Johanna tells him it's okay and that as parents, they may have made mistakes, but they are still the only ones who can correct Roman's behavior. She expresses confidence that the Roman she once knew will help their son get back on the right path. Her husband then asks if she's referring to the issue with the blood fangs. She nods, suggesting that while she might have spoken out of anger, it would be wise to talk to Captain Jonathan to help the boy. The father agrees and calls for a servant, instructing him to summon Captain Jonathan. The next morning, Roman is walking through the town, with Hans trying to stop him, warning him that the blood fangs will likely seek revenge for what happened yesterday. Roman, however, calmly asks when Hans thinks these men became so powerful. Hans admits he doesn't know. Roman explains that in war, fame generates fear, and since the blood fangs are ruthless, that fear has made them more efficient in completing their missions. Hans then asks if Roman is implying that the blood fangs aren't dangerous, or that they are weak. Roman responds that they are only as weak as the amount of fear they can instill in him. The scene shifts to a restaurant where Hans is delighted by a feast that has been brought out, commenting that the food looks delicious. However, Roman stands up and announces that he's going out, instructing Hans to stay behind. He tells Hans that he'll continue the investigation, but that it would be too dangerous for Hans to accompany him. Hans jumps up in protest, insisting that he cannot allow Roman to face danger alone, even if it means risking his own life. Roman pauses, then asks Hans if he truly considers himself one of his men. Hans confirms, declaring that he will always follow the young master. Roman then tells him to withdraw, stating that he can't afford to lose someone as valuable as Hans in such a foolish way, and reassures him that he'll be back soon. Poor Hans is left standing there, unsure of what to say but somewhat touched by Roman's words. As Hans rushes off, he mutters that now isn't the time to dwell on such things. He needs to inform others about what's happening. Roman has realized over the past few days that the blood fangs aren't as strong as they seem. The problem is that they operate in various small groups, making it difficult to eliminate the entire organization. They won't want to punish him publicly, and he can't easily locate them, but if that's the case, he'll just need to make them come to him. That's why he deliberately walked through the city with Hans. Besides, today is Dimitri Knight's training day, so the streets aren't heavily patrolled. If the blood fangs plan to seek revenge, this would be the perfect opportunity. At that moment, a few men call out to Roman Dimitri from behind, and one of them jumps forward, declaring that this is their revenge and that Roman will pay the price for getting involved with the blood fangs. But then someone calls for the captain. A man with messy hair turns around. It's Hans, running toward Jonathan and calling out his name. Jonathan approaches, asking why Hans seems so frantic. Struggling to catch his breath, Hans explains what's happening with Dimitri and urges Jonathan to find him immediately because he's in danger. Meanwhile, Roman effortlessly dodges the first attack, lands an elbow in the attacker's stomach, causing him to drop his dagger, and catches it midair with his other hand. Before the man can react, he's already been struck down. Everything happens so quickly that the man retreats, unsure of what just occurred. The other thugs, seeing their comrade fall, are equally confused. This Dimitri was entirely different from the one they had heard about. Roman simply asks them what they're doing and invites them to come at him, all at once. Back with the soldiers, Hans was frantically explaining the situation with the blood fangs. The soldiers exchanged glances, doubting the story, as it didn't make sense for Dimitri to be taking down the blood fangs. Hans insisted it was true and emphasized that the boy had gone up against all of them, making it dangerous for them to just stand by. Jonathan recalled Roman mentioning this and asking for help, but he still wondered why Dimitri, who didn't even know how to hold a sword properly, was getting involved in such matters. Nevertheless, he gathered the soldiers and instructed them to grab their weapons, warning that they couldn't allow anyone to harm the young master. However, Jonathan was still concerned that Dimitri may have caused trouble with the blood fangs. Meanwhile, the poor blood fangs were already on the ground. They attacked Dimitri, calling him a bastard, but he easily ducked under one swing and jabbed another thug in the stomach. Another bald man tried to approach him from the side, but Dimitri dodged again and landed a kick to the man's belly, causing him to collapse. Dimitri, looking down at the scene, asked if there were only 3 of them. The bald man tried to threaten Dimitri, claiming he wouldn't get away with killing them, but Dimitri laughed and warned that all 3 of them would die if they didn't cooperate. Dimitri then lightly tapped the man's thigh and suggested that it would be in his best interest to answer some questions, starting with the identity of their leader. The scene shifts to another part of town, at the same bar from earlier. As Roman re-entered the bar, everyone inside was startled. The bald man at the counter turned to greet him, wondering why Roman was acting so strangely today and why he was even there. Roman responded with a cheery wave, further confusing the man. The bartender decided to ignore Roman's odd behavior and asked what he wanted to drink. Roman requested a tear of the dawn. The bartender, perplexed, explained that they didn't serve such a drink and asked if he wanted something else. Dimitri then requested the strongest drink they had, as he had something to take care of in the morning. Earlier, someone had mentioned that everything was connected to the tear of the dawn at a bar in the city where Blood Fang members took on their missions. Dimitri had learned the exact code to pass, and that's why he used it. At that moment, the bar fell silent. The bartender signaled to the others in the room, preparing to attack Dimitri, but before he could give the order, Dimitri struck him across the face. The entire bar was shocked by Dimitri's bold move. As the patron shouted to kill him, the townsfolk fled to call the guards. However, it was all over in a flash. Dimitri had delivered a quick strike to the back of one man's neck and a chokehold to another. In no time, several men were on the ground, bewildered, unable to comprehend how the so-called idiot of the Dimitri family had taken down 3 people before they could react. In the world of Merham, one of the strongest aspects of power is the ability to strengthen oneself through breathing techniques. Bak Junghyuk had trained Dimitri, helping to improve his body. Of course, Dimitri was still far from what he used to be, but the men in the bar no longer posed any threat to him. A little later, the bartender began to rise, trying to understand what had just happened. Roman commented that he had gotten up just in time, as he was about to finish things. The bartender, a chubby man, asked why Roman was attacking his establishment. Dimitri called him an idiot, pointing out that the bartender had sent men to attack him earlier. However, Dimitri had some questions he was curious about, so they needed to have a chat. Sometime later, Jonathan arrived at the scene, questioning whether all of this had really been done by the young master. At that moment, a soldier appeared from the 2nd floor and informed Jonathan that it seemed the young master had gone to the Lawrence estate. Jonathan, confused, wondered why Dimitri would go there. The soldier reported that it appeared the base of the blood fangs was located at the Lawrence estate. An hour earlier, Dimitri had warned the bartender that it would be in his best interest to confess everything immediately, as at this rate he would run out of fingers before telling the truth. The bald man snarled that he had nothing to say to the boy and dared Dimitri to kill him, but warned that the blood fangs would take revenge. Roman, smiling, remarked that he liked the man's defiance. It was always more satisfying to break those who resisted the longest. The old man lamented that it was a waste and urged Roman to kill him, but Roman responded that they were there to see just how much the man would endure before breaking. He then held up a photo of the man with a boy beside him and asked what would happen if he found the boy and killed him. The bald man scoffed, claiming the boy wasn't his son, so it didn't matter. Roman, however, noted the striking resemblance and accused him of being a terrible liar. The man cursed at Roman, questioning how a noble could use family as leverage. Roman replied that the blood fangs often sacrificed their lives for revenge, corrupted by threats and debts that involved their families. Roman emphasized that family was the easiest way to control someone. The bartender sneered, saying it didn't matter even if Roman knew the truth, the blood fangs would kill him anyway. Roman coldly advised him to be more careful with his choices and swore on his name that he would kill the boy if the man didn't talk. He gave the man one last chance. Would he bet on the blood fangs and watch his son suffer, or trust Dimitri and reveal the truth? The scene then shifted to a house in a dim alley. A man asked if the rumor was true. His companion confirmed it. An entire division in the city had been wiped out by Roman alone. If the knights got involved, they would be in grave danger. A grizzled old man, resembling Wolverine, was surprised that a boy rejected by the Swordsmanship Academy could defeat a whole division. He asked where Roman was and learned that he had just left the Dimitri region, alone. The old man grinned, realizing that Roman intended to attack their stronghold by himself. He ordered everyone to gather with the goal of killing Roman before facing the Dimitri knights. They would stretch Roman's body out in the town square to remind everyone of the consequences of crossing the blood fangs. The scene transitioned to a castle, where a meeting of elders was in progress. They discussed the Barco family, noting that they had borrowed a large amount of money, likely in preparation for war. The elders realized they needed to consolidate their forces before the Barcos grew stronger. A blond man remarked that war seemed inevitable, something he hadn't expected. A bespectacled elder added that the central government appeared to be backing the Barcos. An older man in a red suit slammed his fist on the table, declaring that they couldn't afford to lose any territory, as the Lawrence family depended on fertile land. Another elder tried to argue that documents confirmed the past debts, but the man dismissed them as lies. The blond man emphasized that they couldn't relinquish any territory or they would lose everything to the other families. Since the Barcos sought conflict, they had to resist with all their might. That was why they had arranged a marriage with the Dimitri family. The men smiled, agreeing that the Dimitri family's wealth and top-notch weaponry would give them an advantage. No matter how much the Barcos borrowed, they would never surpass the Dimitri's resources. The father reiterated that this was why he had pushed his daughter into marrying Dimitri's son, assuring himself that it was the best choice for everyone. Outside the meeting, Flora had been eavesdropping. She was torn, knowing she couldn't accept marrying a man she had no feelings for, but also aware that this wasn't just her father's plan, it was tied to the future of their family. Despite this, she resolved to speak the truth and tell her father she wouldn't go through with the marriage. Just as she steeled herself to confront him, a man arrived urgently, shouting for the Lord. Flora, confused, watched as the man, after greeting her briefly, hurried into the meeting, warning of an emergency. Meanwhile, Jonathan was pounding on a door, demanding to be let into Lawrence territory. The guard insisted he follow proper procedures, but Jonathan warned that if anything happened to Roman due to the delay, they would all pay the price. Another man arrived, informing the captain that Lawrence Square was in chaos. Fearing the worst, Jonathan threatened to break down the door if they didn't open it. Back at the square, the scene was tense. People watched in terror as someone hung, unsure if they should intervene. It was the old Wolverine-like figure, now begging for mercy. All they needed was anyone from the gang to handle it, but in reality, they had multiple armed men. He had been sure there was no way they could lose, or at least that's what he had believed, until he saw everyone dead in front of him. At that moment, he knew he was going to die too. Terrified, he began to stumble over his words, pleading for his life. He stuttered, begged for mercy, and grabbed Roman's leg, asking not to be killed. But Roman coldly threw him into the middle of the city, right in front of everyone. The man pleaded, offering to serve as a dog for the rest of his life if they spared him. Roman, however, responded icily that if the man had intended to become a dog, he should have done so before baring his fangs. Roman then addressed the crowd, declaring that this man was the leader of the Blood Fangs, a gang known for threatening the Dimitri family and deceiving people through dirty tricks. The crimes of the Blood Fangs were well known, and Roman promised to destroy not only the gang but also the evil they had spread. The crowd stood in stunned silence. Jonathan arrived at the scene, speechless as he saw the aftermath. There was no need to explain what had happened to the leader. The scene shifted back to an earlier meeting, where someone asked if it was true that Roman Dimitri had been allowed entry. A soldier confirmed that he had, because Roman was the future husband of Miss Flora. Half an hour later, Roman had dragged the leader of the Blood Fangs through the city and executed him in front of everyone. Flora's father was left speechless, and the others questioned if it even made sense. A spectacled man pointed out that executing someone without the Lord's permission was normally punishable, but the Lord was more intrigued by the fact that Roman Dimitri had single-handedly wiped out the Blood Fangs. He ordered that Roman be summoned, wanting to speak with him personally. Later, Roman was escorted in, along with Jonathan. Flora's father immediately recognized Jonathan as a renowned knight, which led him to believe that Roman had only defeated the Blood Fangs with with Jonathan's help. Roman, introducing himself as the eldest son of the Dimitri family, was asked why he had been so violent. Roman explained that the blood fangs had recently committed a crime and brutally beat an innocent citizen. That was why he had executed everyone in that place. Outside, Flora was eavesdropping on the meeting. She called a knight over and asked if Roman Dimitri had really been brought inside. He confirmed it, and when she asked why, the knight hinted that she might be one of the last to find out, leaving her alarmed. Back in the meeting, Roman continued explaining that he had invaded the Blood Fangs base and killed their leader because of the crimes they committed. The Lord pointed out that Roman had no authority to execute anyone on Lawrence land. Roman admitted this but doubted the Lawrence family's ability to handle the situation, given that the Blood Fangs were infamous for abusing local citizens while nothing was done about it. Roman argued that he took matters into his own hands because he couldn't trust the Lawrence family to act. The two servants in the room were shocked, but Roman expressed disappointment, saying he had expected to be praised for doing the job they had neglected. He then asked if what he had done was truly wrong. The Lord asked his advisor if he knew of the man Roman had executed. The advisor confirmed that they were aware of him being a bad citizen but hadn't realized he was the leader of the Blood Fangs. At that moment, the Lord concluded that the discussion was over, remarking that it wouldn't have been an issue if the Lawrence family had handled it themselves. He then decided to reward Roman and allowed him to leave. As Roman departed, the room fell silent, broken only by the Lord's laughter. The advisor wondered if the Lord had gone mad, but the Lord seemed impressed. He had never imagined that this was the true Roman Dimitri. The advisor tried to argue that Roman's actions couldn't go unpunished, but the Lord dismissed his concerns, saying it was fine since Roman was going to be Flora's husband. The Lord believed that only someone with Roman's courage could achieve great things. The advisor attempted to protest again, but the Lord cut him off, saying he didn't want to hear any more and was pleased with Roman as a match for his daughter. He then ordered Flora to be brought in so he could discuss everything with her. On the way back to Dimitri territory, Jonathan remarked that Roman shouldn't have told the whole truth, as even though they had defeated the Blood Fangs, it seemed the Lords had been angered. Roman simply replied that he had only revealed the negligence of the Lawrence family and pointed out that since the Lord didn't yet know about the cancelled marriage, he wouldn't punish his daughter's future husband. Jonathan quickly realized that Roman had planned everything, leaving him puzzled as to who Roman really was. It was clear he was no longer the Roman Dimitri they once knew. A voice echoed in Roman's mind, calling him by his true name, Bak Junghye, and reminding him that as the son of the celestial demon, he would need to prove he was worthy to succeed his father. First, he would have to survive hunger, cold, and harsh conditions. His father had warned him that if he died, it wouldn't matter, he could simply have another son. The only way to prove his worth was to rule over everyone. Of course, Bak had already faced hardships. A chubby kid laughed, mocking Bak Junghye, saying he expected more strength from the son of the celestial demon, but instead, he found just an arrogant brat. Bak stood up, only to be struck in the face again, helpless against the blows. The other children, watching from a distance, thought he was foolish. While most children were protected by their families, Bak had been forced to survive in a brutal world where only the strong endured. Meanwhile, back in Dimitri territory, Roman was relaxing in a bathtub, enjoying a moment of peace. He marveled at how exhausted his body had become from such simple tasks, but he couldn't deny how much he had experienced since waking up in this world. In defeating the Blood Fangs, he had killed everyone who stood in his way, and he had no regrets. It proved that he hadn't changed as a person. If necessary, he would torture those who crossed him and eliminate anyone who threatened his life. This was the life he had always known, and nothing had changed just because he now inhabited Roman's body. The only issue was that going out had become increasingly dangerous. He didn't fully understand how this world operated, and his true strength had diminished significantly. Roman realized he needed to be more careful in the future. Suddenly, someone knocked on the door, informing him that the Lord wished to speak with him. In the room, Romero, Roman's father, was discussing his son with Jonathan. The knight confirmed that Roman had changed drastically, leaving Romero curious. Jonathan insisted that the young master was not the same person they once knew. Romero admitted that Roman had always been his greatest challenge, his only son with no notable characteristics. However, Roman had been the only one who endured hardships when their family was poor. Romero recalled a time long ago when Roman had given him a piece of candy. When asked what it was, Roman had simply replied, "It's a sweet." At the time, Romero had been working in the mines and warned Roman that it was dangerous. Roman, however, had just smiled, explaining that he brought the candy because his father worked too hard and needed energy to come home sooner. All Romero had ever wanted was for his son to be happy, which was why he had spoiled him, hoping to shield him from poverty. He never imagined it would lead Roman down a reckless path. A part of him had already given up on Roman, but hearing about the defeat of the Blood Fangs filled him with renewed hope. At the door, Roman asked to enter. Romero thought to himself that regardless of how his son had achieved it, Roman had managed to eliminate the Blood Fangs. If that were true, Romero would do anything for his son, seeing this as a chance to redeem his failure as a father. When Roman entered, Romero remarked that he had heard Roman had taken down the Blood Fangs by himself. Bak Jung-hyuk, now inhabiting Roman's body, observed the boy's father closely. He could see the anxiety and hope in the man's eyes, knowing that if he told the full truth, he would be viewed in a different light. Bak understood that accomplishments beyond expectations always came with a price. If he played his cards right, he could buy more time to strengthen himself. As his father continued speaking, Bak debated whether to tell the truth or lie. Hiding the truth seemed the more rational choice. Bak's thoughts flashed to his childhood, when he had been beaten. The bully had taunted him, asking if that was all he had. In response, Bak had grabbed a rock from the ground and smashed it into the bully's face without mercy. The boy fell, gravely injured, and Bak stood up, ready to finish him off. From that day on, everyone feared him. Bak had learned then that in a cruel world, the most powerful always ruled. He declared himself the new leader, ensuring his survival by demonstrating superiority. Now, in Roman's body, Bak decided to say, "Yes, I was the one who took down the Blood Fangs." Bak Jung-hyuk and the celestial demon never knew how to hide their superiority. Sometime later, at the city's training grounds, young trainees were practicing their swordsmanship when they were ordered to stop and show respect to the lord who had arrived. Everyone immediately bowed, but a blond boy among the group looked surprised, wondering why Roman Dimitri was there. The trainer then announced that they would be testing their swordsmanship against Mr. Roman and invited anyone who wanted to participate to step forward. Strangely, everyone was sweating, and no one volunteered. The blond boy couldn't understand why everyone seemed so afraid of Roman, or more accurately, why anyone would want to fight the idiot. An hour earlier, when Roman had confessed to his father that he was the one who had taken down the Blood Fangs, his father had asked how he had managed to defeat them. Needing to avoid suspicion, Roman explained that he had been secretly practicing swordsmanship. His father asked why he had kept this hidden, assuring him that he would have given Roman all the support he needed. Roman replied that he was tired of wasting his life and wanted to prove that even the idiot of the Dimitri family could accomplish something on his own. However, Romero found it hard to believe that someone could learn swordsmanship on their own to the extent of killing trained men. Roman further explained that the Blood Fangs maintained their operations through threats, which was why he set a trap to lure out their leader. His father remarked that the plan was very risky, as they could have easily sought revenge, but Roman said that most of the members were kept in line through fear, and he knew that if he killed their leader, no one would want to save someone who had been threatening them. Romero thought to himself that Roman's plan was well thought out, and his courage was remarkable. To think Roman was capable of such a thing, it was beyond impressive. His father then requested to see Roman's swordsmanship firsthand to understand how much he had truly changed. Back at the training grounds, Romero was startled that no one volunteered to duel Roman. The blond boy thought that whoever hit Roman would be expelled, and whoever lost would be expelled for being so bad, which was why no one wanted to participate. Meanwhile, Jonathan was thinking that they needed someone strong enough to defeat Roman to demonstrate the knight's skill. He announced that if no one volunteered, he would choose someone himself. Since Jonathan, as the master, couldn't participate, there was only one other option. He called out the name Chris, telling him to step forward, which shocked the young man. Chris was the vice-captain of the Adare Knights. The first time he met Roman was a year prior when they had gone to a bar where people were complaining about a drunk causing trouble. They found someone shouting, demanding to know if they were trying to make a fool of him. The attendants apologized, unsure of what to do, but it was the drunken Roman who said that trash like them shouldn't even speak and demanded that the man come over to him. As the staff tried to explain, Roman threw a bottle against the wall. Chris had told Roman to stop, but the boy arrogantly asked who they were. When Chris reached out to grab Roman's wrist to get him out of the bar, Roman slapped him in the face, asking how a lowly knight had the courage to lay hands on him. From that single slap, Chris already knew that Roman had never trained a day in his life. His strength was below the average of a man, and Chris felt sorry for Lord Dimitri for having such a son. He had been convinced that Roman was better off dead, so it was unbelievable that he was now being asked to duel him. Chris tried to tell Jonathan that this wasn't a good idea and suggested there might be more suitable participants participants. However, Jonathan insisted that Roman had taken down the blood fangs, so it had to be him. Before Chris could argue further, Jonathan cut him off, so Chris had no choice but to agree. Everyone was eager to see the duel as Chris and Roman calmly observed each other. Jonathan told them to wait, but at that moment Chris made a request. He warned that he had taken a vow to be merciless in any duel, regardless of who his opponent was. If they accepted this condition, he would participate. Chris was certain that this Roman wasn't the person who had defeated the blood fangs. Jonathan and Romero seemed to agree, and Roman, of course, smiled, which didn't make Chris happy at all. Jonathan remarked that by Roman's smile, he had accepted the challenge. He then told both sides to get ready. While Chris was consumed by anger, Roman was just smirking. The second Jonathan gave the signal, Chris immediately launched himself at Roman, while Roman stood still, waiting for him. Chris delivered a powerful strike, which Roman effortlessly defended against. Those who trained with Chris immediately realized that he was giving it his all, yet Jonathan was already impressed. Roman had actually blocked the strike. Chris retreated and could tell from Roman's defense and stance that he was stronger than expected. Undeterred, Chris resolved to crush him. He launched another slash, but Roman simply sidestepped. Sensing an opportunity, Chris spun his body to attack from the side, but Roman blocked it again. Roman remained calm, observing Chris's attacks carefully. When Chris saw an opening at Roman's back, he believed the match was won. Confidently, he swung his sword, but Roman crouched just in time. The attack narrowly missed, brushing past Chris's face and giving him an unintentional haircut. Terrified, Chris retreated, realizing how close he had come to being struck. Meanwhile, Lord Romero and Jonathan were in disbelief, while Chris's comrades couldn't understand how he was losing to Roman. Chris, too, was perplexed. Roman's skills in defense, evasion, and attack were flawless. Could Roman really have been the one to defeat the blood fangs? He tried to dismiss the thought, convincing himself that Roman was still the same idiot as before. But that's when Roman spoke, saying the warm-up was over and that he would go first this time. Before Chris could react, Roman attacked. Chris barely managed to defend himself at the last second, shocked by Roman's speed. He instinctively moved backward, but Roman closed in relentlessly. All Chris could do was defend, and the crowd grew uneasy as they watched Chris struggle to keep up. Bit by bit, Roman's attacks became overwhelming. Chris, giving everything he had just to block, knew he needed to find an opening. But then, Roman landed a hit on his arm, knocking him sideways. Chris realized he needed to step back, but before he could, Roman was already coming at him with an overhead strike. The movement seemed long and slow, with an apparent opening in Roman's chest. Chris seized the opportunity and struck with all his strength, but it was a trap. Roman dodged easily and smiled, revealing that Chris had fallen right into his ploy. At that moment, Chris knew he was outmatched and had no hope of winning at this rate. The thought of losing to Roman infuriated him, and he gripped his sword tightly. Suddenly, an aura emerged from his weapon. Jonathan, alarmed, shouted at him to stop, but it was too late. Chris had already activated the sword's aura. Even Roman, or rather Baek Jung-hyuk in Roman's body, was surprised by this. The arena erupted in chaos, and the spectators couldn't see through the dust and energy. Romero, worried for his son, let out a sigh of relief when he realized that Roman had narrowly avoided the aura-infused strike. Meanwhile, Chris, disoriented from accidentally unleashing the aura, was promptly struck on the chin by Roman, ending the duel. Naturally, neither Jonathan nor Romero had expected Roman to win, yet there was Chris, lying defeated on the ground. Everyone always asked about the new young prodigy under the captain's tutelage. Others would respond that Chris was one of the best they had ever seen. Despite his young age, he was already a 2-star knight. Rumors circulated that he had started sensing mana after just 6 months of training and reached 1-star status in less than 3 years. Moreover, his swordsmanship was said to be incredible. The women were all curious, eager to know the boy's name. After practice, Jonathan would often dismiss the group, but Chris would always ask to train one more time. This determination excited Jonathan, as Chris not only had talent but also worked tirelessly. To him, Chris was a genius. But now, his genius lay unconscious on the ground, thoroughly defeated by Roman, or more accurately, Baek Jung-hyuk in Roman's body. As Chris lay there, Romero called out to Jonathan, puzzled. He had heard that Chris was a 2-star knight, yet here he was, beaten. The problem was that not even Jonathan could fully grasp Roman's newfound strength. Just a month ago, Roman had done nothing but complain, and yet now he displayed the skill of someone with years of training. Nothing made sense, but Jonathan simply told Romero that Roman was a genius in swordsmanship. Meanwhile, Roman laughed as he looked at Chris. He was impressed by how aggressive and focused Chris had been. With the skill Chris had shown, he could easily have taken down the blood fangs. Jonathan had every reason to be proud of him. However, to the celestial demon, Chris was one of the weakest. Even the weakest warriors of the celestial demon sect were stronger than this. Still, the strange power power Chris had displayed at the end. The aura had caught Roman's attention. Romero, suddenly laughing like a madman, confused everyone. He declared that it was incredible to have a son who was a genius in swordsmanship. He asked Jonathan if he was sure, and Jonathan confirmed that such rapid improvement could only mean Roman was a genius. Overjoyed, Romero called Roman over, telling him it had been a long time since he had been this happy. He told Roman he deserved anything he wanted and to make a request. Roman smiled and mentioned the upcoming war in 6 months. Romero expected Roman to ask not to go, but instead, Roman requested the right to choose who would accompany him. Romero was confused and stunned, even suggesting that Roman could withdraw from the war altogether. But Roman was adamant he wanted to go. Surprised, his father agreed, giving him the right to choose his companions for the war. Roman then made a second request while glancing at the still unconscious Chris. When Chris awoke, he was shocked to learn that he had to teach Roman about aura. He protested, saying it was too much. He didn't even know Roman. And now, after having been knocked unconscious, he had to teach him? It was embarrassing. He even said he'd rather have his head cut off. Jonathan interrupted and made a proposal. If Chris used the opportunity to teach Roman and learn why Roman had changed so much, Chris would earn the right to learn any technique Jonathan had been keeping hidden. Immediately, Chris became excited, asking if Jonathan was serious. Upon confirmation, Chris was eager, thinking this would be easy. He was certain that he would soon possess the secret to becoming a 3-star knight. Though he tried not to seem too enthusiastic, he made sure Jonathan promised to keep his word. By the castle, someone called out to Roman, congratulating him on the incredible duel he had that day. It was Hans, who remarked how amazing it was that Roman had defeated a 2-star knight. Roman asked if Hans knew anything about this 2-star aura. Hans admitted he didn't know much, but said it was related to the ability to use mana. Roman mused to himself, realizing that what they called mana here seemed to be what was known as chi in the Murim world. He was certain that the power Chris had used was similar to a chi explosion, but the way they utilized it here was entirely different. They called it aura, and Roman noticed that the way they used chi here was terribly inefficient. Despite not understanding the full reason behind their methods, Roman knew he needed to learn more about how this power was utilized. He was confident that through training with Chris, he would find the answers. The next morning, Roman stood face to face with Chris, who was clearly not happy. However, Roman wasn't much different until he let out a small chuckle, which immediately made Chris even angrier. Trying to calm himself, Chris explained what aura was, noting that it was essentially the use of mana from a knight's perspective. Mages also use mana, but they do so by creating runes and spells, while knights channel it around their bodies. The first person to explore the use of mana was Emperor Alexander, who discovered that it could be used to strengthen the body. Aura was the ability to release mana instantly, which allowed someone to exert much more strength than usual. However, Chris dismissed the historical context, stating that what really mattered was the ability to sense mana. Only a few people could. According to him, 1 in 1,000 could become a knight, and 1 in 10,000 could become a mage. The minimum talent required to become a knight with aura was the ability to at least sense mana. Chris mentioned that it took him half a year to sense it, with 1 year being considered above average. Roman acknowledged this and asked Chris to explain how to sense mana. Though Chris agreed, he thought Roman was full of himself after winning their fight. He believed Roman would soon experience the harsh reality of training, since swordsmanship and mana manipulation were completely different skills. But what Chris didn't know was that Roman had already sensed the mana of this world. Using the techniques he learned as the celestial demon, Roman had been storing mana in the center of his body. He was only here to understand why this world's method was so different. Chris began walking around and told Roman to feel everything that came into contact with his body. Once Roman became accustomed to sensing mana, he could start trying to manifest it. Success in manifesting it would make him a 1-star knight. Chris went on to explain that aura could be applied to a sword or used to cover the body. However, before he could finish, Chris noticed something startling. Roman was already standing beside him with his mana activated. Chris was at a loss for words. Roman was actually manifesting aura already. Roman, however, was unimpressed. He knew that the way people in this world used chi was inefficient. In the Murim world, chi was scarce and dense, making it difficult to accumulate but also stable within the body. In this world, mana was abundant but light, easily escaping the body. Here, people didn't even strengthen the interior of their bodies, allowing energy to scatter inefficiently. Shocked, Chris demanded to know how Roman had done it. Roman replied with a casual remark, implying that Chris already knew the answer. Frustrated, Chris insisted, saying it had taken him at least 6 months to achieve what Roman had seemingly done so easily. He accused Roman of pretending not to know know how to use mana just to show off. Roman, now understanding why Chris had lost their duel, commented that Chris was just assuming what he wanted to believe. Seeing Chris struggle to understand, Roman suddenly laughed, which only upset Chris more. Chris asked if Roman was mocking his years of effort. Roman responded by asking if, in all his 10 years of training to reach 2-star status, Chris had ever once questioned the methods he was taught. Before Chris could reply, Roman cut him off, explaining that most people blindly follow what's passed down through generations without question. Roman reflected on how, during his own training, he questioned why people clung to flawed methods. Was it because they didn't know better or because their faith in Captain Jonathan's teachings was too strong? Roman acknowledged Chris's hard work but found it amusing that Chris had never questioned his path. As Roman walked away, he mused that nothing in this world was perfect. Things he once held as certainties had changed over time. He knew that questioning oneself could lead to suffering, especially when countless attempts resulted in failure. But despite that, change was necessary. Roman had forged his own path by disregarding his father's teachings and creating his own art. He ended the conversation by telling Chris that their training was over. As Roman left, Chris called out, asking what he should do next. The scene then shifted to a flashback. A man asked a boy if he was going to continue suffering or admit defeat. From now on, the Blood Demon sect would follow Baek Jung-hyuk. The man's only concern was how he could become as strong as Baek Jung-hyuk. He was willing to dedicate his body and soul to the cause as long as they both grew stronger. The Blood Demon was someone so powerful that he unified all the sections. As someone who dominated the Murim world, it was inevitable that he would eventually face Baek Jung-hyuk. After a long, intense battle, the Blood Demon was defeated. Roman recalled how, in the past, the Blood Demon had swallowed his pride and sought guidance from his conqueror. The desire to grow stronger at the cost of one's pride reminded Roman of the Blood Demon. When Chris asked how he could become stronger, Roman admitted that he didn't have an easy answer. Chris seemed confused, but Roman explained that blindly following what others taught wouldn't lead to true strength. If Roman taught him anything, Chris would only be following another method without thinking critically. What Chris needed to do was seek the answer for himself. The only hint Roman gave was for Chris to stay by his side. In 6 months, Roman would go to the battlefield, where Chris would see him defeat countless enemies and grow even stronger. Roman believed that if Chris was still by his side in 10 years, he would have found the answer to his own path. That same night, Chris lay in bed, isolated and deep in thought. He recalled how everyone had told him that the right thing to do was to train until he became more than just a regular human. He remembered Jonathan's teachings and the moment when he was told he had achieved the rank of a 2-star knight. But Roman's laughter and his mocking comments filled him with anger. Jonathan, sensing something was different, asked Chris what was going on. Chris confirmed that he would be going to the battlefield with Roman in 6 months. Surprised, Jonathan asked if something had happened. Chris acknowledged that something had, but he didn't go into details. They locked eyes, and Jonathan realized that Chris had a reason for this decision. Jonathan admitted that from now on, Chris would no longer be part of the Dimitri Knights. No matter what happened, Jonathan hoped Chris could protect Roman on the battlefield. Chris thanked him, and Jonathan realized that the young boy he had once found clinging to a dead woman on the battlefield was no longer a child. Jonathan then told Chris that if he truly wanted to follow Roman, it seemed Roman was no longer an idiot. Jonathan urged Chris to follow him, telling him that from now on, he would need to be prepared. If Chris wanted to survive on the battlefield, he needed a secret weapon of his own. Excited, the knight followed Jonathan. The scene shifted to the city, where rumors were spreading that the idiot of the Dimitri family had wiped out all the blood fangs. Kevin, from earlier in the story, overheard people saying that Roman had kept his word. Kevin, who had seen Roman take down 3 men with a stick, wondered if the rumor could be true. However, Kevin doubted that Roman would go so far just for him. As he pondered, his boss interrupted him, telling him to get back to work. Kevin, who only wanted to become strong enough to protect his family, felt helpless. He knew there were many more dangerous groups like the Blood Fangs in the world, but as a peasant, how could he become stronger? Training wasn't an option. He wouldn't even get the chance. Suddenly, someone called out to Kevin, causing him to drop the crate he was holding. It was Roman. Surprised, Kevin asked what Roman was doing there, then quickly corrected himself, bowing deeply and thanking Roman for saving his family. Roman asked how things were going, and Kevin confirmed that the Blood Fangs were no longer after them. He had even found a job, but Kevin didn't know how to properly express his gratitude. Roman told him not to worry. There would soon be an opportunity for Kevin to repay him. Roman proposed something that would change Kevin's life. His family would no longer have to worry about money. They would have a house, good food, and wouldn't need to work in harsh conditions anymore. The only price was that Kevin would have to swear loyalty to Roman and live for him. Kevin was silent for a moment before bowing his head to the ground, pledging his loyalty. He swore he would live and die for Roman, and if Roman promised to take care of his family, that would be enough. Roman saw that Kevin was a man who expressed loyalty with his own blood. In his past life, the Mad Demon was someone who could wipe out entire clans with a single word. Perhaps that was why, when Roman thought of summoning someone, Kevin's name came to mind. It was truly worth seeing the boy again. From that point forward, Kevin belonged to him. Back at Dimitri Castle, Roman handed Kevin over to Hans and asked him to help the boy adjust. Roman mentioned that he would return later, and Kevin expressed his deep gratitude. With that, Roman left and headed to the library. Roman began studying the path of the Aura Knights. The first stage of their journey was the manifestation of Aura, which qualified someone as a 1-star knight. At 2 stars, one needed to be able to cut through steel with their aura. 3-star knights transcended normal comprehension and were considered special in any kingdom on the Salamandra continent. There were a few 6-star knights in the world, but no one had ever heard of someone reaching the 7th rank. Even among the 10 strongest people in the world, not all were 6-star knights. Roman noted that given Chris's strength, Jonathan must be a 3-star knight. 6-star knights were nearly incomprehensible in their power, as their aura could reach heights of 12 meters and impact the entire world. Only 12 6-star knights existed in the world, and Roman realized their strength was formidable, even with such inefficient methods. On the other hand, there were the arcs, sorcerers who had reached 7 circles of magic. They were considered half god, half human, capable of incredible destruction. A single spell from one of them could split the sky in two. Unfortunately, magic didn't exist in the Murim world, but Roman now understood some aspects of it. Though he couldn't afford to make enemies of them just yet, Roman was intrigued by the possibilities and knew he would eventually encounter them. Roman then decided to begin his own training. The scene shifted to Hans opening a room for Roman. When Roman asked what the room was, a servant explained that it was the old forge, and no one had access to it anymore. Roman remarked that it was the perfect place to train. He told Hans that he would be staying there for the next week and instructed him to keep everyone away. Roman made Hans swear that unless there was a grave emergency, no one was to disturb him. Hans agreed, and Roman was left alone. The room was filled with straw, which Hans had put there to make it more comfortable. Roman appreciated the gesture but preferred to do without it. Over the past few days, he had been accumulating energy in the center of his body. Now it was time to develop the techniques he had used in his past life. Roman activated the first stage of the Celestial Demon Arc, circulating all his energy to remove the impurities from his body. The cultivation process was brutal, with blood pouring out everywhere. Roman had anticipated this and had accumulated the right amount of energy. He needed to regain his past strength as quickly as possible. This first stage of the technique was called the human stage, and it was the first step toward his goal. A week later, a bald man offered to bring tea and drinks to Count Lawrence and Miss Flora. Lawrence asked where Roman was, and the bald man explained that Roman was currently handling some business. The man then closed the door, leaving them alone. Lawrence remarked that it was clear they weren't welcome there, and he instructed Flora to sit down. He called her by name and explained that he had arranged this meeting to reverse the mistake she had made. Flora replied that she understood, recalling the moment when her father had yelled upon learning she had broken off the engagement. Flora explained that she had already spoken to Roman and had tried to follow her father's advice, but her father interrupted, reminding her that he had always thought she was an intelligent child. He had not expected her to make such a reckless decision. She needed to understand that the Barco family had borrowed a large sum of money from the bank, meaning a war would soon begin. The marriage with the Dimitri family wasn't just a decision, it was inevitable, as they were the only family capable of standing against the Barcos in this region. Flora argued that the Lawrence family wasn't weak and questioned why they couldn't win without the Dimitri family's help. Her father explained that the government had approved all the documents without proper checks. The bank's large loan indicated that this conflict had already escalated beyond the families. This battle was designed for them to lose, and their defeat would result in losing everything: their land, their honor, and even Flora, known as the flower of the Lawrence family. In the present, Flora reflected on all of this. She knew the decisions her father had made were for the best, yet she had ignored it all for her own selfish reasons. She realized she needed to wake up to reality. She couldn't live like a flower forever. Meanwhile, Renzo was wandering around, unsure of what to do. He knew that as soon as Roman appeared, he would need to inform him that Flora had been waiting since the morning. The problem was that it was already late afternoon, and Roman had told him not to disturb him. Finally, the door opened, and Renzo, beaming, called out for the young master. However, her, he was in for a shock. However, the scene shifts back to Lawrence. He already expected this treatment because of first mistake. He knows that the Lawrences need this political marriage, but even so, it didn't sit right with him. Suddenly, he stands up and Flora calls out to him. He announces that he's going to sort this out and find Baron Dimitri on his own. Someone calmly takes a few notes. Then suddenly Lawrence opens the door and asks why he's making a visit and waiting so long. If he's dissatisfied, he could have just said so. He never expected Dimitri to be so petty. However, Romero is just standing there, observing. Romero says he understands what Lawrence said but asks if today's meeting was scheduled in advance. The Baron mentions that he understands he showed up unannounced, but it's been a week since he's been asking to speak with Roman. If they had at least refused from the start, they wouldn't have been offended. However, Romero asks why he would refuse a visit from the Lawrences. But now, he wants to know if that's all Lawrence has to say, and if he really barged into the room just to complain about being tired of waiting until noon on the day Flora visited. Roman himself had said he wanted to end that marriage. Even though they argued with the boy, he was sure Flora didn't want the marriage either. Even if it was a disgrace to the Dimitri family, he decided to say nothing and stay quiet like a fool. After all, it was she who came there just to say it wouldn't work out, even though, at the beginning of it all, it was the Lawrences who were pushing for it to happen. And now Lawrence was there, barging into the room and complaining just because he had to wait for a while. Even worse, for a meeting that wasn't even scheduled. And he has the nerve to complain as if it's Dimitri's fault. Roman then reveals that not long ago, he received a message from the Barcos. It was an offer for a political marriage where they would gain connections with the central government and a piece of the Lawrence's land. Even so, he decided to refuse that offer. He asks Lawrence why he thinks he did that. Lawrence, also questioning this, wonders because, to him, it would obviously be more advantageous to ally with the Barcos. Roman says the reason is simple. The Dimitri family has enough power for him to choose whatever path he wants. And since his eldest son liked the young lady from the Lawrence family, that was the reason he opposed the Barcos. At that moment, Lawrence realizes he messed up because of his foolish ego. The father says he understands his son's reputation for being an idiot and that the fame of the two doesn't match. But even so, he needs to keep in mind what kind of family they are. Roman's name completely changes the moment the Dimitri family is associated with him, and that's why those who should be desperate for this marriage aren't them but, in fact, the Lawrences. Or perhaps, did Lawrence misunderstand something? Suddenly, Flora remembered the days she used to go to the academy when she was younger. That was the place where many children from renowned families went to build their knowledge as nobles. However, there was one family from the north that had only one person there. The boy was so quiet that one could question if he really existed. That was the son of the Joe family. In a place where the children believed they were treasures born into this world, he was distant until one day he made a small mistake. For the other children, that wouldn't mean anything, even if they made big mistakes. However, in his case, it resulted in a disciplinary committee, and on the day the teacher scolded him, a father approached and apologized. He begged for his son to be forgiven and said he would teach him better. At that moment, from a distance, she could only think of one thing. She felt sorry for him. However, right now, all of this seems funny to her. The Viscount apologizes and says he has nothing to say. Meanwhile, Flora realizes she had no right to feel sorry for that boy. The Viscount says his daughter made a mistake out of immaturity. At that time, the Joel family was weak, and this is the same case for the Lawrences today. Once again, the father apologizes, saying that his entrance was disrespectful, and Flora understood that the weak had no choice but to bow to the strong. It was then that she began to lean forward to apologize to Romero. However, at that moment, someone entered from the door. They announced that Master Roman had arrived, and Flora realized she had learned this lesson too late. Roman had dyed his hair white, and he was dressed in dark clothing. He entered the room and announced, "Roman Dimitri greets his father." Everyone was confused, and the father asked if Roman had finished his training. He replied yes. His father said they could discuss it later. He was called there to discuss the marriage with the Lawrences. All of this had started because of a decision Roman made, so he would respect any choice Roman made. Roman quickly understood what his father was trying to say. He knew the significance of the alliance between those two families. At this moment, when the Lawrences are in danger, the wealth of the Dimitri family would serve as protection. The father asks if Roman requested this marriage even knowing that. Roman said that, at the time, he thought that was enough of a reason. However, However, everything changed when he met her for the first time, and she immediately talked about canceling the engagement. She had certainly heard the rumors and decided she wouldn't marry someone like him. Because of that, this means that all of her decisions were based on what others said. Regardless of how society judges them, he wants to be with someone who only believes in what they experience and see, and it is for this reason that he votes to end the engagement. Lawrence thought this marriage was the last card they had. No other family would accept a political marriage under these circumstances, meaning they would have to solve their problems on their own. The problem was that if the Dimitri family and the Barcos really joined forces, the Lawrences wouldn't stand a chance. He needed to do something to prevent that. Bowing, Lawrence said that the Lawrences took full responsibility for this situation. As an apology, they would no longer collect taxes from any Dimitri merchant passing through their territory. Though he knew this wasn't much, given the Dimitri's wealth, it was a gesture of sincerity. Romero, however, refused. He said the Dimitris couldn't profit from his son's future. All they needed to do was announce that Flora had cancelled the engagement, and they wouldn't align themselves with the Barcos. Lawrence thanked him. Of all his fears, this had been the greatest, and with that, he left the room. Before leaving, he looked back, only to see Roman Dimitri standing there. If he had known the potential of this young man earlier, he would have acted more assertively when speaking with Flora. In the end, he too had made a big mistake. Romero then called Roman and asked what had happened to him in the past week during training. Roman explained that all he did was remove impure chi to advance to the human state, a basic technique in the Murim world. However, because the area had abundant mana, its accumulation in the body led to a miraculous effect. The physical changes were evident, as his skeletal structure had transformed, showing that he had become a different person. Roman then told his father that he had achieved an awakening on his own, and the change occurred when he began to feel mana flowing through his body. Romero was shocked, as this process typically took years. He had heard of a rare phenomenon where mana began circulating naturally, but it happened to very few. Still, Roman had defied logic, having already taken down the blood fangs. Despite everything, Romero reminded Roman that he was still his son, and no matter the challenges, he would always support him. He made sure Roman understood that he was a Dimitri, and his father would never abandon him. At that moment, Bak Jung-hyuk recalled a flashback from one of his own training days. His father had always seen him as a failure. However, the man in front of him wasn't cold or cruel, nor did he push him to the brink of death. Jung-hyuk silently thanked his father, realizing it wasn't so bad after all. When he left the room, someone called out to him. It was Flora, looking awkward and unsure of what to say. She apologized for judging him harshly and for causing trouble between their families. He simply walked away, saying she didn't need to apologize since he had never intended to accept the engagement from the beginning. Flora continued, explaining that even though the arrangement had been for both of them, she was the one who chose to break the promise. She revealed that the reason for her decision stemmed from a social gathering in the north. Once the nobles discovered her engagement to Dimitri, they spread terrifying rumors. The worst rumor she heard was that Roman Dimitri used drugs. She wanted him to know this, though she wasn't sure if it was true or false. Still, she couldn't ignore it. Roman interrupted her, stating that none of it mattered. Whatever had happened didn't change their relationship, and she no longer needed to concern herself with him. Flora was left standing there, speechless and alone. Later that night, Roman had a conversation with Hans. He found it odd that Flora had mentioned drugs, as he hadn't felt anything of the sort in his body. The purification had removed all the impurities during his transformation. Curious, Roman asked Hans if he had ever heard of him using drugs. Hans, hesitant at first, assured Roman he wouldn't be reprimanded for speaking honestly. Hans explained that while he hadn't seen anything directly, Roman had behaved strangely on several occasions. The last time was 15 days ago, after returning from a social gathering. Roman had seemed distant, as if he had lost the will to live, and isolated himself in his room. Every night, he asked for an excessive amount of alcohol, which led Hans to suspect possible drug use. However, in hindsight, it seemed like a foolish assumption. Roman then recalled that Flora had mentioned the noble gatherings and asked who had organized the event. Hans responded that it was Anthony, the eldest son of the Barcos family. Roman began to piece everything together. The moment others learned he was Flora's fiancé, he had fallen into a suspicious state. Now, he had a clearer idea of what had happened. There were a few things that bothered Roman about the details surrounding his own death. In the message left behind, it said he was too afraid to go into battle, and that's why he took his own life. However, at that time, his marriage to Flora had already been decided, yet there was no mention of it in the letter. Not to mention, the marriage would have been an easy way for him to avoid the war, so the idea of him taking his life out of fear didn't make sense. Something didn't add up. Roman then asked Hans if he and Anthony Barcos had always been close. Hans explained that they had been friends for a long time, but things had changed recently, particularly after the marriage proposal with the Lawrences. This marriage was a huge obstacle for the Barcos, who wanted to conquer the Lawrence lands, and the fastest way to prevent that was by stopping the marriage. This confirmed Roman's suspicion that the Barcos were behind the letter. Hans then mentioned that a few days ago, another letter had arrived, inviting Roman to a Barcos party. This piqued Roman's curiosity. Hans explained that he hadn't delivered it because Roman was in isolated training and asked what he should do with it now. Roman laughed, realizing that the Barcos were underestimating him, something that the celestial demon within him despised. Roman asked when the party would be, and Hans informed him it was in 2 weeks. Roman then ordered Hans to inform them that he would definitely attend. The scene shifted to the next day, as Kevin was led to speak with Roman. Hans had already warned Kevin not to be surprised by Roman's change in appearance. When Kevin entered, he asked if Roman had called for him. Roman confirmed this, but Kevin was immediately startled by the young master's new look and asked what had happened. Ignoring the question, Roman asked if Kevin was adjusting to his new surroundings. Kevin replied that the place was good and that he had no problems, but there was one thing he was still trying to understand: what his role would be there. He had offered his life for Roman's sake, but he didn't know what an ordinary commoner like him could do. Roman told him that he would be used as one of his swords. Kevin, confused, asked what that meant. Roman explained that it was impossible to choose someone's path for them, so he would give Kevin 3 options. The first option was if Kevin was afraid of killing, he wouldn't be a sword but rather the hands and feet. He would learn everything from Hans and become a loyal follower. The second option was to become the sword and protect Roman by his side. Kevin interrupted, saying he had never used a sword before, so it was impossible. Roman responded that he had already anticipated that if Kevin chose this path, he would need to undergo skeletal contortion, a process so painful it would feel as if his bones and muscles were being broken. It was a way to prove one's determination through pain, not words. Drawing his sword, Roman offered the final option. Kevin would take the sword and cut off his own hand. If he could endure causing pain to himself and withstand it to the end, he would become stronger than anyone. Roman reminded him that even the mad demon, who knew nothing of martial arts, had become a king, all through sheer willpower. Roman told Kevin to choose, assuring him that no matter the option, he would make it worthwhile. The only thing Roman was deciding was how Kevin would be used. In an abandoned cabin outside Dimitri Castle, Kevin had grown up working to survive. He was capable in many tasks, but no matter how hard he worked, someone always took what was his. That was the life of the weak. This is why he couldn't forget the overwhelming power he witnessed from Roman that day. He couldn't understand how cutting off his hand would make him stronger, nor the idea of destroying his own body. However, if it meant becoming as strong as Roman, he was willing to do it. Roman simply observed as Kevin prepared to make the cut. Taking a deep breath, Kevin raised the sword, let out a shout, and went to make the cut. Meanwhile, outside, Chris was talking about his decision to follow the young master, only to find out Roman had gone into isolated training. Chris found Hans and asked where Roman was. Hans explained that Roman was training with Kevin but warned Chris that no one was allowed to interrupt them. Chris, unfamiliar with Kevin, asked who he was. Kevin made the cut. Roman that he didn't think the boy would go through with it, but he had. Roman simply stood by and watched. Later that night, Hans noticed Roman's sword was covered in blood. When he asked about it, Roman calmly said there was nothing to worry about, the blood wasn't his. In truth, Roman had planned to put Kevin under a demonic illusion. The beauty of the demon's illusion technique was that it could create false pain. However, Kevin had made the cut before Roman could activate it, and if Roman hadn't intervened, Kevin would have actually cut off his entire arm. There were still 2 weeks until the Barcos party and 6 months until the war, but Roman was eager, as he had many lessons to teach, and soon, he would be very busy. In a room, Roman explained that the mana cultivation technique he was about to teach Kevin was extremely dangerous. Kevin, excited, asked if he was really going to learn about mana. Roman simply said yes, but in truth, the technique he was going to teach was the Mad Demon's spiritual art, a power that consumed the user's mind in exchange for strength. However, it could only be used by someone capable of enduring immense pain. Roman had put the mad demon through this process to make him useful, and if Kevin hadn't hesitated to cut his own arm, Roman believed he could learn it. Roman warned Kevin that the technique would indeed make him stronger, but the pain would be far worse than what he had endured the day before. The reason Roman was teaching him this was not just because it was the fastest way for an untrained teenager to grow stronger, but also because it was a technique that would allow Kevin to protect those he cared about when he reached his peak. Kevin was thrilled and called out to Roman, expressing how grateful he was, but he didn't understand why Roman trusted him so much. He pointed out that although he had sworn loyalty, nothing could stop him from running away after learning the technique. He wanted to know why Roman trusted him. Roman simply replied that he trusted Kevin because he did. This left Kevin even more confused, but Roman ignored it and told him to rest, as training would begin tomorrow. Roman thought back to how the mad demon had asked the same question once. Unconditional trust is only received when you believe in a person. However, Roman knew Kevin wouldn't betray him. Once Kevin became stronger, he would realize how dangerous it was to betray the celestial demon. After all, who would dare betray such a powerful figure? The next day, training began. Roman was teaching Kevin step-by-step swordsmanship and how to maintain focus in each movement. Meanwhile, Chris was watching from the side, utterly bored and confused. He couldn't understand why Roman was wasting time teaching swordsmanship to someone who seemed to have no talent, or worse, why he himself wasn't learning anything. Chris had followed Roman, hoping to get stronger, but felt like he was being treated as if he didn't even exist. He wondered if it would be better to return to his previous master and ask to be accepted again. Still, for now, he decided to wait a little longer. After a few days of watching, Chris grew frustrated. He threw his gloves to the ground, walked up to Roman, and confronted him. It had been 2 weeks since Chris had decided to follow Roman. In the first week, Roman had gone into isolated training, and in the second, he had been ignoring Chris while focusing on Kevin. Chris apologized for his initial behavior, but made it clear that he wanted to learn something. Roman looked at him and reminded him that he had already told him to learn by observing. Of course, Chris had no idea what that meant. Roman explained that everyone has their own way of learning. Kevin didn't know anything yet, so he needed training to reach a certain level. On the other hand, Chris was different. Because he had been defeated, he would accept any lesson Roman taught without questioning it. Chris asked if Roman really expected him to just keep watching. Roman tossed the sword to Chris and explained that he needed results to understand the truth. That's why there would be a duel, Chris against Kevin. Kevin, who was malnourished and inexperienced, was shocked at the thought of fighting a real knight. Chris, of course, didn't want to fight a novice either. He grew angry, wondering what Roman thought he would gain from this, but eventually decided to prove himself. Roman explained that Kevin was clearly at a disadvantage, but he had nothing to lose by being defeated. There were countless people in the world stronger than Kevin, just like Chris was stronger than him now. Was Kevin always going to back down whenever he encountered someone stronger? Determined, Kevin decided to give it a try. Chris, enraged that a novice thought he had a chance, couldn't understand what Roman hoped to achieve from this fight, but a duel was a duel. As soon as Roman gave the signal, Chris was in front of Kevin in an instant. There was no way Chris could lose to someone with only a week of training. He landed his first attack directly, and Kevin, noticing something, tried to make a move with his sword. However, Chris easily knocked his arm aside and hit him square in the stomach, sending Kevin flying. Kevin landed twisted on the ground. Chris found it strange that the boy was so weak and wondered what the purpose of this duel was. He thought maybe Roman would step in and do something, but he didn't. Roman just stood there, watching. Chris couldn't understand what the madman was thinking, but either way, he was going to end this soon. Time passed. Despite the beating, Kevin didn't give up. Chris admitted that Kevin was much tougher than he had expected, and had done much more than anyone without mana should be able to do. Still, Chris warned that if Kevin continued, he wouldn't hold back and wouldn't take responsibility for any broken limbs. Kevin simply laughed, which left Chris confused. Roman smiled as Kevin responded, saying he wanted to see how this would end. Roman once again instructed both Kevin and Chris to prepare. Suddenly, Kevin heard a voice telling him to focus as a surprise attack was coming. Roman gave the signal to begin, and Chris lunged. This time, Kevin managed to block the first strike. The voice told him to step aside and aim at Chris's chest, but Kevin stumbled, allowing Chris to knock his arm aside and land another hit to his stomach. Kevin fell, and the voice urged him to get back up. That's when he realized the voice sounded like Roman's. Roman explained that he was using the mana fluctuation technique, which allowed sound to be transferred. He was manipulating small particles near Kevin's ears so only he could hear the instructions. Kevin was surprised that such a thing was possible. possible. Roman then told him to dive to the right, which Kevin did, causing Chris to miss. Roman instructed him to aim at Chris's left side, but Kevin's strike was too slow, and Chris dodged, landing a hit on Kevin's ribs. Kevin quickly realized that his weakness was speed. The voice told him to block an overhead attack and then move to the right, but Kevin once again took a hit to the face. Despite the beating, he didn't give up, and Chris was impressed by his resilience. Roman, on the other hand, observed that Kevin wasn't fast enough to react to the commands in time. Still, he found the situation interesting. Kevin, smiling despite his struggle, thought Roman was all-knowing. Even though Chris was a 2-star knight, Roman seemed capable of giving perfect commands to help Kevin win. Kevin understood that the real problem was his own body. Had he been fast enough to follow Roman's instructions properly, he would be winning. He realized that Chris, not he, was the one truly being manipulated in the fight. Following another instruction, Kevin dodged and attempted a counterattack, which Chris barely avoided. Chris retaliated by landing a punch to Kevin's face. Chris started to notice that, while Kevin was still receiving blows, he was no longer being knocked out. His strikes weren't as powerful as before. Kevin, too, began to understand that Chris, the so-called genius knight, was nothing compared to Roman. For Kevin, Roman was the type of master he would follow without question. Despite being warned by Chris for the 10th time to give up before getting seriously injured, Kevin smiled again and insisted on seeing the fight through to the end. Losing his temper, Chris called him insignificant and promised to cripple him if he continued. However, just as Chris prepared a powerful strike, Roman instructed Kevin to step forward and stop the attack midway. Chris suddenly found himself in a bad position but managed to step aside just in time. He couldn't believe that Kevin had the courage to move forward in such a dangerous situation. Roman then told Chris to calm down, as the fight wasn't over yet. Kevin, once again following Roman's commands, made another slow attack, but Chris dodged easily. However, Kevin had set a trap. Chris had no time to avoid the next strike, and Kevin landed a solid hit. Roman watched with a smirk, while Chris, shocked, realized he had almost been defeated by a boy who had only been training for a week. Furious, Chris struck Kevin's hand, causing him to drop his sword, and the exhausted Kevin fell to the ground. Roman, impressed that Chris had recognized the second attack as a feint, approached and acknowledged that Chris had won. He offered to personally teach Chris from the next day if he wished, but the choice was his. Sometime later, Chris, worn out and confused, reflected on the fight. He wondered why he had accepted the duel, as he had almost lost despite having nothing to gain. That last move Kevin had used resembled Roman's technique from their first duel. Chris realized that if it weren't for his prior experience with Roman, he might not have been able to beat Kevin without using mana. The experience had taught him that he still had a long way to go. The next day, Roman asked Chris what he had decided. Chris responded that he no longer wanted direct teachings. Instead, he would grow stronger just by observing Roman. The duel had taught him that Kevin's decisions, though seemingly his own, were always the right ones for each situation. Even though Chris hadn't realized it, Roman had been guiding Kevin all along. Chris knew that Roman operated on a level far beyond even Captain Jonathan. Until the day Chris became stronger than Roman, he would watch and learn from him. While Kevin smiled, Chris looked at him with pure hatred. Roman simply said that training would continue that day. A few days passed, and soon the date for the Barro's social gathering arrived. A week before the social gathering, a group was observing a painting when someone asked if they had heard about Roman Dimitri canceling his engagement to the girl from the Lawrence family. One of them commented that it was supposedly Flora's fault, but most people believed her father just pitied her after seeing the idiot from the Dimitri family. A woman remarked that it was absurd, especially since they were about to go to war with Barcos. The man next to her responded that it only proved the eldest son of the Dimitris was worse than they had thought. Someone mentioned that Roman supposedly defeated the blood fangs, but another dismissed it as a lie meant to cover up the broken engagement and avoid embarrassment. Meanwhile, Antonio Barco was laughing, saying it was easy to manipulate Roman. His plan to break off the engagement had worked perfectly. He asked his butler if Roman would attend the upcoming party, and the butler confirmed it. Antonio was thrilled that everything was going according to his plan. On the day of the social gathering, Roman questioned whether he really had to wear the extravagant clothes prepared for him. Hans explained that since it was his first appearance after breaking the engagement, he needed to wear something impressive. Hans went on about how expensive and incredible the clothes were, knowing Roman wouldn't usually wear such an outfit. Roman smiled and agreed to wear them, appreciating Hans' efforts. Meanwhile, outside, Chris was waiting by the carriage, complaining that Kevin was taking too long. Kevin, who looked more like a child, came running, apologizing for the delay. He admitted he didn't know how to put on his armor properly. Chris asked why he was wearing armor that didn't fit, and Kevin explained that there was no armor in his size. Despite Kevin's clumsy appearance, Chris couldn't forget how close he came to losing to him, even though Roman had helped him. Chris sternly told Kevin to remember that they were not only representing Roman, but also the entire Dimitri family, so their actions affected their reputation. Kevin, calling Chris Sir Knight, promised to keep that in mind, and Chris beamed, pleased to be called a knight. Inside the castle, many nobles from prestigious families were gathered. One noble, holding a glass of wine, asked if it was true that Roman Dimitri would really show up. Another laughed, saying it was amusing that Roman was attending after breaking the engagement that he had requested, especially with the Barco's family targeting the Lawrences. A girl remarked that this was why everyone thought Roman was a fool, noting how Dimitri's position had become ambiguous because of him. Another noble commented that at least Roman was showing up, likely trying to clean up the mess. A blonde girl, curious about Roman, asked what he was like. The man next to her replied that Roman left a terrible impression. He wasn't strong, tall, or handsome. Another commented that any woman would try to break off an engagement if she were forced into it. At that moment, the butler announced the arrival of the eldest son of the Dimitris. As Roman entered, shining with his platinum hair, no one could recognize him. The girls were flustered, wondering if this was really Roman Dimitri, as he looked entirely different, taller, with a more refined appearance. The blonde girl, stunned, quickly approached and introduced herself as Sophia from the Grisel family. She mentioned that her family was small and not well known, but Roman replied that he knew them. She was impressed. Roman mentioned that it was impossible not to know a family with a history spanning hundreds of generations. Hans had given him a book about the noble families of the northern region, and Roman had studied it, noting that the Grisel family was famous for the quality of the wood they produced. He even congratulated her on her brother recently learning to sense mana. The other nobles were taken aback, observing how well-informed Roman was. Soon after, another noble introduced himself as the eldest son of the Vault family. Roman greeted him warmly, noting that Viscount Vault had achieved several victories in recent battles. The young man expressed his gratitude for Roman's efforts. A woman with pink hair, Lady Ares, approached and commented that Roman had changed. Roman, in turn, complimented her beauty, which only made people more intrigued. As more nobles engaged with Roman, one man admitted that he had misjudged him, previously thinking Roman was always drunk. Roman joked that while he had considered drinking, he would abstain for now. Suddenly, the butler approached and informed Roman that the young master was calling him to the back room. Roman knew this was his chance to find out who had been causing trouble for him. Outside, the gathering was surrounded by knights, each family having brought their soldiers. Kevin asked Chris why there were so many people, but Chris told him not to concern himself, as he would never attend such an event. He then ordered Kevin to adjust his helmet. As Kevin innocently fumbled with his armor, one knight with green hair burst into laughter, mocking him for being part of the Dimitri escort. The knight loudly remarked that it was laughable to think the eldest son had brought along a child who didn't even know how to hold a sword. Chris, annoyed, told Kevin to ignore the insult, but another knight chimed in, questioning if this was really the level of the Dimitri family. The scene shifts to a flashback from a long time ago, where Roman attended a social gathering and saw Flora for the first time. As he was observing her, Anthony approached and asked who had caught his attention. Roman asked if he knew the blonde-haired girl, and Anthony replied that she was Flora, the flower of the Lawrence family. Roman, clearly smitten, was captivated by her. Now, in the present, Roman enters a room excitedly and asks Anthony how much he's changed since they last saw each other. Roman remains observant while Anthony admits he knew Roman had changed but not this drastically. He invites Roman to sit down and share what had happened. Roman quickly noticed signs that others had been there earlier and that Anthony made everyone leave before his arrival. It became clear to Roman that Anthony had something secretive to share, so he made an effort to make him feel comfortable. Roman joked that even he had lost track of how much he had changed after spending a fortune on himself. Anthony, watching him closely, remarked that it was positive in some ways. Then, Anthony brought up an incident from the past when Roman had been caught sleeping with his cousin, even though he was already promised to the Lawrence daughter. He found it amusing that Roman was still moving forward with the marriage despite that scandal, but if Roman was at the party now, it meant he was planning to accept the proposal. Anthony assured Roman not to worry, promising to keep the past incident a secret, and suggested they discuss Roman's marriage to the Barco family. family. This revelation took Roman by surprise, and he suddenly recalled memories of betraying Anthony Barco by begging his father to arrange a political marriage with the Lawrence family. Despite his feelings of guilt, Roman didn't want to alienate his old friend and hoped to rebuild their relationship. Back then, Anthony had introduced him to Emily Barco, and Roman recalled how Anthony had joked about Roman getting full of himself just because he was going to marry into the family. Roman had brushed it off, thinking everything was fine. That night, they had drunk together, and the next thing Roman remembered was waking up in bed with no memory of what had happened. Anthony had burst into the room, furious, demanding to know what Roman had done. Confused, Roman had no idea because he had passed out. Anthony then revealed that Roman had slept with Miss Barco and offered him an ultimatum. Either he would break off the marriage with the Lawrence family, or he would have to marry a direct descendant of the Barco family to maintain relations. Despite his anger, Anthony said he was willing to forgive Roman because they were friends, but Roman needed to give an answer. Back in the present, Roman fully understood the gravity of the situation. If the events of that night were revealed, the honor of the Dimitri family would be destroyed. Roman didn't have the courage to face his father's wrath, but at the same time, he couldn't break the marriage with Flora, whom he genuinely loved. If he did, it would defame her and ruin her reputation. Roman, feeling trapped, believed the only solution was to take his own life. He saw himself as a weak man who had never accomplished anything on his own, a truly miserable and pathetic existence. Anthony, sensing Roman's hesitation, reminded him that a union between their two families would create immense power in the region. Together, they could control the north, and no one could stand against them. But Roman simply asked if that was the only reason for this political marriage. Anthony, confused, paused for a moment. Roman then questioned why he should accept a marriage based solely on power, and Anthony tried to remind him that he didn't have a choice. If Roman refused, everything from that night would be exposed. In response, Roman boldly placed his foot on the table and said that it seemed Anthony had forgotten something. He then declared that the Dimitri family had no reason to accept the Barco family's proposal. Meanwhile, outside the gathering, everything seemed to be going smoothly until Sophia noticed Roman leaving. She approached him, asking where he had been. Roman explained that he had something urgent to take care of, and although she looked disappointed, he excused himself. As he walked away, people begged him to stay longer, saying they still wanted to talk about many things. However, Roman apologized and continued to leave. As he was heading out, he overheard someone telling another person to take back what they had said. Recognizing the voice, Roman moved closer to investigate. That's when he saw something he didn't expect. A helmet hit the ground, and one of the knights struck Kevin. The scene begins with a man mocking the Dimitri family, saying that this was the level of their knights. Chris told Kevin to calm down, saying it wasn't worth it. However, the mocking men had noticed something. Kevin, whose helmet didn't even fit properly. They approached and taunted, saying it looked like they had picked up a child from the streets, dressed him in armor, and called him an escort. Chris, unfazed, asked if they were training more to be clowns than swordsmen, but the man ignored him, boasting that he could easily defeat Kevin without any training, further insulting Roman by calling him an idiot. Kevin, undeterred, told the man to take back what he said about Roman. The man was confused, but Kevin grabbed his hand, demanding again that he take back the insult. That's when the man slapped Kevin's helmet, knocking him to the ground. Chris considered drawing his sword but knew these were Barco's knights, and doing so would cause chaos between the Dimitri and Barco families. It wasn't just about protecting the young master, it was about safeguarding everyone present. From the ground, Kevin, undeterred, declared that he was Roman's knight and that he'd never want to be a knight if it meant being like the thugs mocking him. The man chuckled and moved toward Kevin, saying he wanted to see how far his pride would take him. But just as he was about to strike again, someone grabbed his wrist. Everyone was shocked. It was Roman. Calmly, Roman asked what was going on. The moment the man tried to speak Roman's name, Roman slapped him. Completely confused, the man didn't understand what had just happened. As he tried to speak again, Roman slapped him once more. The man, shrinking with each slap, tried to say something again but got hit in the ear. He was now so humiliated that he was about to fall to the ground, traumatized, unsure of what was happening. Roman simply told him to lift his head. Meanwhile, inside the gathering, Anthony couldn't understand what had just happened. He warned Roman that refusing the Barco proposal would be an irreversible mistake, but Roman dismissed this, saying that his reputation was already bad and a few more rumors wouldn't make a difference. Roman warned Anthony to behave better, stating that he had chosen to cancel the marriage on his own terms, not because of Anthony's threats. Anthony had technically achieved his goal of breaking Dimitri's Dimitri's alliance with the Lawrences, but Roman reminded him that at any time he could decide to help the Lawrences, which would interfere with Barco's plans. Roman knew a lot about the Barcos. They had influence in the central government, but little else. If one considered true wealth and power, the Dimitri family was the real force in the north. Roman then asked Anthony what he wanted to do now. Anthony, fearful, asked if Roman was no longer going to support the Lawrences, and Roman confirmed that he wouldn't. Realizing he had no other choice, Anthony agreed to drop the matter. However, he couldn't understand why Roman had changed so much. The way he acted, looked, and even spoke had completely shifted. Roman was no longer the foolish boy he had once known. Just then, someone called for Anthony, who initially didn't want to be disturbed. However, the person insisted, saying there was a problem with the knights he had brought. Outside, the Barco knight was now kneeling at Roman's feet, begging for forgiveness, swearing he would never do it again. Kevin, seeing the knight's desperation, said the man had been punished enough, and Chris agreed, advising the knight to reconsider his relationship with the Barcos. However, Roman calmly stated that he would decide when the punishment was enough, even if it meant the man's death, as that was the price for his actions. At that moment, Anthony arrived and demanded an explanation, warning Roman that, as the eldest son of Dimitri, he wouldn't tolerate such behavior and advised him to start apologizing. Roman, unshaken, asked why he would apologize when the man had insulted him and laid hands on a member of the Dimitri family. He then asked Anthony if he truly believed Roman was in the wrong. Anthony, realizing the delicate nature of the situation, replied that while Roman had crossed the line, he understood why the punishment was necessary. Roman warned Anthony that if he continued like this, their relationship might be destroyed, advising him to control his actions better since Roman wasn't a patient person. Anthony, recalling Roman's earlier threat to rekindle relations with the Lawrences, had no choice but to back down. Reluctantly, Anthony admitted that Roman was right and that he would have had to punish the knight in the same way. Roman then walked over to the knight, raising his hand once more and telling him to prepare his face. The humiliation continued, as Roman was no longer the weak fool everyone once disrespected, even though his family was the greatest power in the north. Calling Chris and Kevin, Roman said it was time to leave. Everyone present had no choice but to recognize that the idiot they had heard so much about no longer existed. On the way back in the carriage, there was silence. Kevin apologized, saying Roman had been insulted because of him. Chris also apologized for not doing anything when they spoke ill of the Dimitri family. Roman stayed silent for a moment, then acknowledged that it must not have been easy for them to endure until he arrived. He praised them for holding on, as acting hastily would have led to the worst-case scenario. However, he reminded them that no one in the north should ever have the courage to lay hands on the Dimitri family. They were to remember the faces of those men and never forgive them, because Roman didn't accept anyone being above him. He told them that the only people who could follow him were those who stood above everyone else, and they would have to learn to live that way. Back at the Dimitri mansion, Hans handed over papers about the Barco family. He mentioned that lately, the Barcos had been taking strange actions. Roman already knew that the Barcos had appeared in the northern region over 100 years ago, but they only started gaining relevance when someone from the family entered the central government. Roman commented that their military strength was much weaker than he had expected. Hans agreed, saying it was strange that their status was so high despite their weakness. Roman said this proved how strong the central government was. The Salamander continent had 6 kingdoms, with Cairo being the smallest and weakest. To survive, they joined the central government, where authority and recruitment were absolute. If a family rejected recruitment, troops were immediately sent, and once the kingdom was taken, the lands were divided among those who participated in the conquest. Roman believed that was why the Barcos were so influential. Hans added that the Barcos had recently taken out a large loan from the bank. With that money, they had likely bought mercenary companies, most notably the Burgess Mercenary Company, famous for territorial disputes. At the current pace, Hans estimated that the attack on the Lawrences would happen in half a month. Roman knew that if that were the case, they had little time left to prepare. Hans commented that if the Barcos attacked, the Lawrences would survive for at most a month. Roman reflected that although he had told the Barcos he wouldn't get involved in the Lawrence case, he couldn't live as Roman Dimitri if he let someone threaten him and get away with it. Moreover, no matter what the Barcos did, they could never defeat the Dimitris. It would be easy to crush them with the power of his family, but in the region, because they weren't nobles, the Dimitri family wasn't seen as a threat. Roman needed an opportunity to enter the grand stage of the world, just as he had done in the past. He stood up and told Hans that he needed to find his father. The scene shifts to a frightened city, where a man in bloodied armor arrives. It's the rank B mercenary, Lucas, who remarks that apparently the Dimitri family hasn't changed at all. The scene then shifts to a blacksmith. The man complains that his items are destroyed and asks Lucas if the fight was that difficult. Lucas replies realized that the battle was tough because his comrades were so dumb, and almost everyone died. The blacksmith criticizes the sword's low quality and asks where Lucas got it. Lucas said he had to grab it from some random shop and nearly lost his life because of it. The old blacksmith reminds him that the best weapons and items are always made by the Dimitris. Lucas stands up, saying he already knows that, which is why he's here to request a full set. It didn't matter how long it took since he would be recovering in Dimitri. He was tired of the battlefield. That's when he noticed a gathering of people looking at flyers. Curious, he wondered why everyone seemed so excited, as it usually only happened during a war or when there was a really good job offer. He took a closer look and saw a recruitment notice. It stated that applicants needed to be healthy and have the desire to get stronger. There were 30 spots available, with a salary of 8 silver coins per month. Lucas thought that, considering a family of 5 lived on 5 silver coins, it was a good deal, even with the risks. However, there was a special condition. The recruits would belong to Roman Dimitri and not the entire family. Only those willing to risk their lives for Roman should apply. The old blacksmith warned Lucas not to even dream of it, as hundreds of people had already applied. Lucas laughed, saying that as a rank B mercenary, someone like him would cost at least 50 silver coins. Then, realizing what the blacksmith had said, Lucas asked if hundreds had really registered. The blacksmith confirmed, saying that everyone who saw the notice ran to apply. Lucas, still incredulous, asked why anyone would be so eager to work for the Dimitri idiot. He imagined the suffering a soldier would endure under someone like that. At that moment, the blacksmith and everyone else fell silent. The old man calmly replied that Lucas must not be well informed since he was an outsider. Lord Dimitri had taken down the blood fangs and was caring for his people. No one believed it at first until they heard what Clark had to say. Since Clark's son became one of Roman's subordinates, his entire family had changed. The blacksmith recalled that the boy's name was Kevin. A little earlier at the mansion, Kevin asked why Roman wanted him to take a break, but Roman simply said that rest was part of training. He gave Kevin 3 days to relax as a reward for his hard work, encouraging him to enjoy time with his family. Kevin thanked him, but taking a break felt strange to him, especially since he'd previously worked every day just to survive. He wondered how his family was doing, as he had been away at the castle for a long time. On his way out, Hans met Kevin, handing him some clothes and informing him that Lord Roman had prepared these for him before he went to meet his family. Hans also gave him some money so he could buy gifts for his family. Kevin, who would now be earning 30 silver coins a month, was told to spoil his parents a little. As Kevin walked through the city, bright and cheerful, he reflected on how he had never worn such fine clothes or felt this calm before. For the first time, he was bringing fresh bread to his family, his sister's dream, as she had always complained about eating hard bread in the past. Buying such luxuries had always been impossible for Kevin, considering the dire situation his family had faced, but now things were different. Kevin vowed that he would grow stronger under Roman's guidance so his family would never struggle again. However, upon arriving home, Kevin noticed something strange. His mother was calm, his father was eating pastries, and his sister was playing with flowers. He hadn't expected them to be living so comfortably. His family excitedly greeted him, hugging him and telling him how much they missed him. Kevin wanted to ask about the house, but his father explained that Hans had given it to them to cultivate. He also mentioned that the city's knights had helped them move. Overcome with emotion, Kevin began to cry and thank Lord Roman for everything. That's when his father noticed the slap mark on Kevin's face. He immediately asked if Roman had hit him, but Kevin explained that it wasn't Roman. His mother, concerned, told him he didn't need to lie. Kevin reassured her and insisted that Roman wasn't that kind of person. He then explained the truth about the incident, and later, his father shared the story with his friends at the bar. They were shocked to hear that Roman had hit a Barco knight just because of an insult. The entire city was aware that the Clarks' lives had improved significantly since Kevin started working for Roman. Not only had they received a house, but they also got land and a farm. The story was so unbelievable that people speculated it might just be someone who resembled Roman. But now, poor children across the city dreamed of being like Kevin, working for Roman, gaining his trust, and improving their own lives. That was why so many people had flocked to the recruitment. Lucas, however, couldn't believe what he was hearing. The Roman Dimitri he had seen in a casino 2 years ago would never have acted this way. He wondered what could have changed in that time, and curiosity drove him to investigate further. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, someone commented that the preparations were proceeding smoothly. They were ready to provide some of the soldiers, and Lord Roman was handling the entire process. However, the person asked if it was really wise to continue, pointing out that relying on one person for an army was dangerous. dangerous. Romero, Roman's father, reflected on how he had initially thought Roman would team up with the Barcos to remove his younger brother from the line of succession when he heard about Roman attending a social gathering. Instead, Roman had defied Anthony and beaten up his knights, despite the risk that Anthony might join forces with the Barcos, which could have jeopardized Roman's claim to succession. This made Romero realize that his son had begun living according to his own desires, especially after the blood fangs incident. As a father, he was curious to see what Roman intended to achieve. Jonathan assured Romero that everything was fine and confirmed that more than 500 people had already registered, far exceeding the 50 people needed to form an army. Romero, unaware of the full extent of his son's growing influence, was surprised by the number. The scene then shifts to the day of the recruitment, where a large crowd eagerly waits to see what will happen. Chris heads to the back to call for Roman, informing him that all the preparations for the test are complete. A day before the test, Lucas was at a bar, drinking heavily, commenting that Dimitri's dark beer was always the best. However, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. There were far more applicants than he had imagined. Not to mention, 3 loud guys in the corner, with copper plates on their thighs, indicated they were at least rank SE mercenaries. The others at the counter clearly had combat experience, and given how many bars were likely filled with similar people, the level of applicants was much higher than he had expected. Lucas couldn't understand why so many experienced people were applying for this job, considering they could find better opportunities elsewhere. As Lucas pondered, he overheard a conversation. A man asked his friend if he wasn't planning to become a Lawrence soldier. The friend responded that he was, as Lawrence was his hometown, but after seeing Dimitri take down the blood fangs, he changed his mind. The man described how Dimitri had shown up in the square, covered in blood, dragging the blood fangs leader by his hair. It was hard to believe that Dimitri had traveled from his own territory just to kill someone who had messed with his people. The memory of that scene never left the man's mind. Though some people denied the incident, claiming it was a lie, the man had witnessed it firsthand. Dimitri wasn't the weak and idiotic person the rumors portrayed him to be. He was a leader who fought for his people, and that was why the man was there, hoping to gain residency in Dimitri and become one of his subordinates. Lucas began to understand that people believed it was worth dedicating their lives to Dimitri. Maybe this entire commotion wasn't a coincidence. On the day of the test, excitement filled the air as everyone chatted while they waited. Lucas, however, was still undecided. Even though the strongest people there, like him, had doubts about the rumors, he knew that the decision could only be made once he saw the true Roman. Suddenly, everyone fell silent. Roman Dimitri approached, armored, and passed by, causing everyone to bow their heads. Lucas noticed that no command had been given, yet everyone instinctively lowered their heads. This was proof that the rumors were true. Roman climbed the stairs and addressed the crowd, telling them to lift their heads. He explained that, as stated in the notice, he would be recruiting 30 soldiers to fight by his side. However, he also made it clear that he had no intention of living in an isolated territory for the rest of his life. He planned to continually fight and conquer larger territories, engaging in wars where losing lives would be inevitable. He warned them that those who were not fully determined should turn back now. On the battlefield, when their heads were flying, they shouldn't feel resentment for being sent there by him, but regret for not standing by his side when he reigned supreme over the continent. The entire crowd fell silent. Lucas couldn't comprehend why someone in Roman's position, who was even risking his own family, could be so arrogant. Yet, for some strange reason, he believed Roman. Chris stepped forward and explained the test instructions. The test was simple. They would stand in a designated spot while an archer fired 3 arrows at them. The arrows might graze their body, hit the wood behind them, or even strike them directly. Only those who didn't flinch after all 3 arrows were fired would pass the first stage. The first name was called. A man stood in front of the wood, and the archer prepared to fire. Others questioned whether they were really going to risk their lives for this test, believing that a skilled archer like this one surely wouldn't make a mistake. The first arrow was fired, landing dangerously close to the man's neck. The man figured it must be a psychological test. He just had to stand still, confident that the arrows would miss. But in a shocking turn of events, the second arrow struck him, causing him to collapse, writhing in pain. Chris immediately ordered the man to be treated and carried away on a stretcher. The crowd began to panic, questioning whether Dimitri was really asking them to be hit by arrows. Chris, unfazed, called the next name, Morrison. Morrison had witnessed what happened to the first man, and he knew that if the arrow had struck his head instead of his leg, he could have died. This test was insane, and all Morrison wanted was his chance to become a knight. Chris, noticing the fear spreading through the crowd, announced that the second man had also given up. He warned that anyone afraid of being hit by an arrow should quit now and ordered all cowards to leave immediately. Earlier, someone had mentioned they would explain each person's role. The 4 present tomorrow would be hit by an arrow. The man next to them was the best archer in the region and would only aim for non-fatal spots. The reward they would receive for this was a chest full of gold coins. Obviously, taking an arrow for such a prize seemed worth it. Roman said there would be medics on hand, but it wouldn't change the fact that the arrow would be real. He asked if the men still wanted to proceed, and they all said yes. With that, the men left, and Chris asked why Roman was going to such lengths. Roman explained that you can't build an army with threats alone. He needed people willing to put their lives on the line. Even if the chance of being hit was 1 in 100, some people would still quit because of that 1% chance. Chris then asked what condition people had to meet to become his subordinates. Roman said he wanted someone with an extremely resilient psyche and mentality, someone born with the heart of a beast. Chris was confused, wondering why that was more important than experience. Roman explained that someone like that would become stronger than anyone else, regardless of their background. Only those stronger than everyone else would walk by his side. Now, everyone was wondering what kind of insane test this was. A good portion of the applicants were already leaving, saying it wasn't worth taking an arrow just for a chance to serve Dimitri. Chris mentioned that at least 100 had already left and turned to call for Roman. He was thinking about the heart of a beast, an innate talent, just like Kevin, who was willing to cut off his own hand without hesitation, or like Chris, who endured public humiliation just to ask how to become stronger. Those are the kinds of people who have the heart of a beast. No matter how strong someone's physique is at birth, they can't defeat someone like that. That's the type of person Roman wanted to find in this test. He gave the order for the test to continue. The next participant was panting heavily. Lucas remembered this guy from the bar. It seemed he was serious when he said he wouldn't give up. But now, he was trembling, clearly terrified. Still, this was his only chance to show loyalty, and there was no way he would quit without trying. The first arrow nearly grazed his head. He looked at it, knowing he could have died. Another arrow was being prepared. He wondered if he should give up. The second arrow hit right next to his arm, and he knew that leaving now would render everything meaningless. But the last arrow was coming, and there was still time to back out. He wanted to say something, but the fear was overwhelming. And then, the third arrow struck the middle of his leg. Chris announced that Henderson had passed. Lucas realized that the man was about to quit but had gotten lucky with the timing of the arrow. The test continued, and out of 500 participants, after 100 fled, 400 remained. Of those, only 120 had the courage to endure all 3 arrows. Roman observed each person who passed, those who trembled but stood their ground and those who didn't even flinch. To him, both types were equal, for they had the courage to suppress their fears. Now, it was time to start searching for the hidden gems, those who would look at Roman with admiration, not fear. Roman congratulated everyone but warned that he would only accept 30 people. To select them, there would be a second test. Those who became his subordinates would live the life of a predator. Strangely, he said nothing more, leaving Lucas confused. Roman simply stated that the orders for the second test were straightforward. There were various swords of different types and shapes beside them, but none of that mattered. They just had to choose a sword and prove their worth in a duel against him. Lucas wondered if Roman really planned to fight 120 people. Roman announced that all they needed to do was last 1 minute against him. Those who passed would receive even better conditions than those previously mentioned. A bald man stepped forward and declared he would go first. He had the look of someone who had fought 1,000 times. Let's see if he could endure this, Lucas thought. They were already face to face. Roman asked the man his name, and he replied, Vulcan. Roman questioned whether the sword was satisfactory, to which Vulcan responded it was not an issue. Vulcan thought Dimitri's confidence was a bit overblown. Sure, Roman had taken down the blood fangs alone, but surviving for just a minute shouldn't be impossible. Chris then told them to prepare. Vulcan, thinking that surviving a minute would be easy, was more interested in testing the man he was going to serve. As Chris gave the signal to start, Vulcan immediately lunged, saying he would find out what kind of man Roman really was. He launched his attack with all his strength, but in a second, Roman had dodged and was already at his side. With a simple tap of his foot, Roman made him fall. Vulcan tried to get back up, but at that moment, Roman's sword was already at his neck. Roman simply called for the next participant. At that moment, Lucas realized this man was on a completely different level. When everyone saw Vulcan being instantly defeated by Roman, they understood how strong he was. However, they all thought the same thing. As more and more duels took place, Roman would eventually tire, making him easier to defeat. Yet, by this point, half the duels had already happened, and 60 people had been defeated. Roman showed no signs of fatigue. Henderson reflected on what Roman had said before this all started. Surviving as a predator. It dawned on him that Roman truly lived like a predator, a person who does whatever he wants in a world where only only the strongest survive. At this moment, Roman was still considered the fool of the Dimitris. For many, this might be the only chance to become his subordinate. The problem was, how do you defeat a monster like him? At that moment, Roman announced that if no one stepped forward, everyone would fail. Finally, a man stepped forward, declaring his intent to participate. It was Lucas's turn. He introduced himself as participant number 61. He already knew Roman Dimitri was a monster compared to what he had seen so far. Roman's abilities were overwhelming, and it was unbelievable how much pressure he exerted just by standing there. After watching the earlier duels, Lucas fully believed Roman wouldn't just stand still. Lucas didn't care about the 8 silver coins a month. He was more curious to see where Roman would be in a year. But to witness that, he first had to pass this test. Chris was impressed. Lucas was the first person to attack directly since the very first participant. Not to mention, his right hand aimed for Roman's head while his left hand was prepared to counterattack at Roman's heart. Roman easily blocked the first strike, and Lucas noticed Roman's backward movement had put him out of the dagger's range. Still, Lucas wanted to see how Roman would handle the situation, so he threw the dagger in Roman's direction while launching another sword attack. However, Roman blocked the sword attack and deflected the dagger with the scabbard. As soon as Lucas saw this, he retreated once more. From his experience, Lucas knew that any knight would eventually show some opening as they grew tired. Yet Roman was like an impenetrable fortress. Lucas couldn't afford to hesitate. If he did, it would be over. If he wanted to pass this test, he had to maintain the initiative. Roman smiled, asking if his name was Lucas, and told him it wasn't bad at all. Roman noted that Lucas's approach wasn't ideal for a battlefield, but it was the right attitude for a duel. Clearly, Lucas had natural instincts, but Roman wasn't going to let him last a minute so easily. The real purpose of this test was to demonstrate the strength of the squad Roman was going to create, and to establish the power difference so they would never forget it. To do that, he had to end this duel decisively. Roman launched an attack while Lucas was still dodging. Lucas, being a B-rank mercenary, was fighting at the limit of a regular person with no chi control. Since the first condition for reaching A rank was awakening chi, Lucas had reached his maximum potential as a B rank. Despite this, he had survived battlefields where countless chi users had perished. Time and again, he stayed alive by any means necessary. Roman's attack was interrupted, and Chris remembered that Roman had never said anything about not being able to throw sand in his eyes. The only mission given was to survive for a minute, nothing more. As soon as Lucas fell, he immediately got up and attacked again. However, he stopped for a moment. Roman, whose eyes were red from the sand, was still looking directly at him, fully prepared to defend. At that moment, Lucas laughed, dropped his dagger, and declared his surrender. In the Celestial Demon Cult, the first thing you learn before fighting is how to keep your eyes open at all times. In a fight, a blink is enough to cost someone their life. Just like breathing needs to be controlled every second, blinking is also something that must be considered. This is why they train to keep their eyes open in any situation. No matter what happens, a person must never give in to fear or try to escape without observing the situation. Roman is handed a bottle of water, and as he washes his face, he stands there, feeling desolate. Lucas regrets using sand, realizing that Roman didn't even change his expression. Instead, it made Lucas feel pathetic for using every dirty trick and still failing. He wonders if Roman would be disappointed, but then remembers that Roman had no expectations of him. Perhaps he thought he might be punished, but Roman simply called for the next participant without even commenting on the tactic. Lucas is confused, and the crowd wonders the same. Why didn't Roman mention the dirty move? But Roman had already anticipated Lucas's plan the moment he dodged the attack. He saw Lucas's hand move to his waist and grabbed the sack of sand, but he allowed it to continue to see what Lucas would do in that situation. The hell Lucas had experienced, and the amount of blood he had seen, convinced him that Roman had faced far more, possibly enough bloodshed to create an ocean. That's how a celestial demon is born. Roman asked if any other applicants would step forward. Time passed, and another man entered the field. Once again, Roman dodged the attack, but now everyone was trying to fight dirty. One participant even threw a stone at Roman. Chris noticed that Lucas's influence was encouraging others to try lasting at least a minute, but even these tactics weren't enough. Lucas realized that using dirty moves wasn't a disqualifier, but it also didn't cause Roman any pain. As the duels continued, 2 hours passed, and Roman's breathing remained steady. And Roman reflected that on a battlefield, no one gives you a break just because you're tired. Your movement's slow, your breathing becomes unstable, and that's how you become just another corpse. To survive, breathing must be perfect and continuous. Roman, however, knew how to circulate nature's chi to alleviate fatigue, and combined with skeletal changes, he kept his body in peak condition. During his time under Baek Junghye, Roman had participated participated in wars that lasted up to 3 days, so this training wasn't enough to tire him. Chris then told all the applicants to gather. He announced that the number of people who passed the second test was 0, but that didn't mean no one would succeed, as they still needed to select 30. He told them all, "Good job," and dismissed them. A while later, Roman handed in the list of participants who had passed. He informed Chris that he would have to train them, and Chris agreed, taking a look at the names. Vulcan, who had lost in one move, had shown enough courage to go first, and that made sense. Henderson had also passed, though Chris hadn't found anything special about him. Perhaps Roman saw something he didn't. Most of the names were understandable, except for one, Lucas. Chris asked if Lucas really passed, and Roman confirmed it. When Chris questioned why, Roman responded that Lucas, despite being a B-rank mercenary, had committed a grave foul and even surrendered before being attacked. Chris worried that Lucas would cause problems on the battlefield, not just because of honor, but because mercenaries like him often abandoned comrades to survive. Roman explained that was exactly why he passed Lucas. Of course, Chris was confused, but Roman elaborated. Lucas wasn't a coward who clung to honor. In that moment, when everyone was concerned about Roman's judgment, Lucas saw an opportunity and acted instantly. That's the kind of person who survives on the battlefield, someone willing to do whatever it takes. Roman then asked Chris why he was so sure Lucas would betray his comrades just because of one foul move. Roman recalled Jonathan once saying that those who survive on the battlefield aren't necessarily those who know how to use aura, but those who calmly analyze situations and act accordingly. No matter how strong Roman was as a knight, there was always the chance he could be killed by those who hide in the shadows and strike when the moment is right. Chris realized that Lucas's actions were indeed the most realistic response for someone in that situation. Once again, he admitted he had been the one unable to see things clearly. However, Chris then told Roman there was something else he didn't understand. The battlefield wouldn't start for another 5 months, and it wasn't like the nobles were completely forced to fight, as political solutions could often be found to avoid war. So why was Roman already gathering his soldiers when he could simply escape? Roman responded that it would be announced soon, the official letter from the Barco family. In the letter, the Barcos claimed they had waited long enough for the Lawrences to fulfill their past agreement, but the Lawrences had betrayed their honor and commitment to the nobles. The Barcos declared they would raise their swords after much patience. They accused the Lawrences of refusing to pay the debts owed by their ancestors and of having the audacity to declare they wouldn't surrender any land as collateral. This notice was to inform everyone in the kingdom of Kiro that the Lawrence family had 1 week to surrender their lands, or else the central government would support a territorial war against the Lawrences. When Chris heard this, he asked if that's what Roman was preparing for. Roman confirmed it, saying that this troop would indeed be involved in the war between the Barcos and the Lawrences. Someone remembered their failure to the family, the person responsible for causing the Dimitris to no longer support the Lawrences. The blame fell on Flora, who felt guilty for everything happening to her family and the territory. She woke up in the middle of the night, haunted by nightmares, asking herself what she had done. At the Lawrence mansion, everyone speculated whether it was because of the broken engagement. It seemed Dimitri had rejected her because of a mistake she made. Now, she wouldn't even leave her room, and with the war against the Barcos looming, she couldn't even get out of bed. Flora always thought of herself as a smart person, having passed the advanced class at the academy with great grades. Her father's warm smile convinced her that she was a good daughter. But now, she realized that without her family's support, she was nothing more than a flower trapped in a cage. They called Roman the fool of the Dimitris, but in the end, she felt the real fool was her. She no longer had the confidence to face her father, wondering what he would do in this situation. When she thought about it, Roman was the complete opposite of her. No one had any expectations for him, but with his strength, he subdued the blood prisoners and elevated the family's name. She didn't understand how he had done it alone or why he was so strong. The difference between them was that he had the courage to act. Just then, a butler knocked on her door, informing her that a meal was ready. The servants exchanged worried glances as Flora never appeared. Finally, she opened the door, visibly shaken, and said she was going to the library. She knew her father was doing his best to get help from other families, but deep down, she knew no one would aid them. Just like Roman dealt with the blood prisoners by himself, they would have to find their own way out of this situation. Meanwhile, someone came to Lawrence's room, informing him that the Martel family had refused their proposal. Lawrence instructed them to contact the Vaster family, but they had also refused. The messenger explained that no one wanted to risk supporting them in a war against the Barcos, especially since the central government had given its backing to the Barcos. Worse yet, there were rumors that whoever supported the Lawrences would suffer retribution afterward. Even those who didn't participate had a chance to receive lands. Meanwhile, Flora sat in the library reading, knowing that only a week remained before the war began. She had just that much time to come up with the best course of action. In another part of the mansion, her father punched a table in anger. He raged that the people who once favored him now turned their backs when war approached. He asked if the gold bank would lend them any money, and he was told that an investigation would take a week to complete. That made it clear they were siding with the Barcos. Frustrated, Lawrence asked if there really was no solution. One of the men at the table suggested that surrendering to the Barcos might be the best option. All the support from their neighbors had been withdrawn, so surrendering might at least protect some soldiers and prevent them from losing everything. No one in the room could argue against that. Even Lawrence said it was something to consider. However, just then, someone at the door announced that Flora wanted to speak. Lawrence was about to say he was busy, but Flora entered the room. Her father asked what she was doing there, and she replied that she had something to say. But before the conversation could continue, the story shifted back to Roman's conversation with Roman's father. Roman had just said that the Dimitris would get involved in the war between the Barcos and the Lawrences. Roman's father, confused, asked if he understood what that meant. Roman affirmed that he did, and his father questioned why he wanted to involve himself in a war that had nothing to do with them. This was a legitimate war sanctioned by the central government, and since Roman had broken off his engagement with the Lawrence lady, they had no obligation to get involved. If they entered the war without reason, the other nobles would sever ties with them, and they would be crushed. His father remarked that Roman wasn't as rational as he thought he had become. But Roman called his father and asked him how he wanted him to live from now on. His father, perplexed, asked why he was bringing this up, but Roman explained that his involvement in the war wasn't a decision made on a whim. He revealed that Anthony Barco had threatened him, complicating his previous engagement. He didn't have time to plan then, but when he heard the news, one thing became clear. Roman noted that people said the Dimitris were the true strength of the north, yet the Barcos still believed they were superior. As lord of the territory, his father had done nothing to challenge this. Roman believed his father was content with the status quo, but Roman Dimitri was different. He wanted power and wouldn't stand by while the Dimitri name was tarnished, whether by the Barcos or anyone else. He had more than enough reason to act, just as the Barcos were using this war as an excuse to gain more power. In this new life, Roman felt like he was in an endless ocean, but his identity as Bak Jung-hyuk hadn't changed. He would live a life of domination. Roman told his father he wasn't asking for the family's help. He would participate in the war as Roman Dimitri. All his father had to do was watch as Roman showed him the path he would take and the life he intended to live from now on. Roman's father knew that no matter how great one became, your birthplace never changed. Even if Roman had vast wealth and a prosperous territory, the fact remained that he was a commoner by birth. In their conversation, Liana asked if anything had happened with the nobles when he went to the capital. Roman sat down and replied that it was nothing much, but he noticed it from their looks. Clearly, they viewed him differently from others. Liana asked if he wanted to change that, said he was content with his current life and had no desire to stray from his path just to gain more. His only hope was that his children would be different. Unlike him, content with ruling a remote land, he wanted his children to surpass their origins and reach higher. His father realized that Roman's gaze had changed in a way he couldn't alter. This was the moment he had long dreamed of. His troublesome son had grown up without him even noticing. With this understanding, his father told Roman to do as he wished and ask for any help he needed. Roman was a son of Dimitri, and that meant he didn't need to carry the burden alone. The scene shifts to a bustling blacksmith street, with numerous shops and factories lining the roads. Roman realized it wasn't an exaggeration when they said this was the largest blacksmith district in the capital. Just on this single street alone, there were 30 open and functioning blacksmith shops. Anyone who wanted to understand how the Dimitris amassed so much wealth only needed to look at this place. The steel mines behind the Dimitri territory were the largest on the continent, enabling the blacksmiths to sell equipment at lower prices. That's why the nobles in the Cairo region dared not challenge the Dimitris, not only because of their wealth but also out of fear of losing access to the weapons they provided. Roman was searching for someone specific, the symbol of the Dimitri family and a master blacksmith. He had told his father that he would handle the matter alone, but he needed help with the equipment. His father had instructed him to speak with Master Hendrik, the best blacksmith around. Even after becoming a noble, Roman's father had been surpassed by Hendrik in terms of skill. Roman's father assured him that if he mentioned it was a request from him, Hendrik would provide everything needed. However, Roman was warned that the Dimitri blacksmiths were proud. They wouldn't be kindred just because he carried the Dimitri name. Only someone who understood the quality of steel and had the skill to use it could earn their respect. As Roman walked down the street, he noticed the stairs, just as his father had said. This was to be expected, considering his past actions. In the shop, one of the workers noticed him and told Hendrik to take a look at who had arrived. Hendrik asked what Roman was doing there. Roman responded that his father had likely sent word about his arrival. Hendrik Hendrik scoffed, asking if Roman meant the equipment for 30 soldiers. Hendrik then accused Roman of saying that just to steal some items and sell them off, assuming he was out of money. He gestured to some equipment on the side, saying it was more than enough to arm 30 soldiers. Roman asked if those were the only items available. The blacksmith confirmed, and Roman questioned if that was truly the best Hendrik could offer. Hendrik retorted that, of course, it wasn't, but he wasn't satisfied. He told Roman to disappear from his shop. Roman, unfazed, picked up a sword and remarked that the reputation of the blacksmiths here seemed to be exaggerated if they called this soldiers' equipment. Roman asked once again, calmly but firmly, if this was really the best work of Master Hendrik. Hendrik lashed out, saying the equipment was of the highest quality in all of K-Continent, and that a boy who had never sweated in front of a forge was in no position to judge. He added that if it weren't for Roman's father's request, Roman wouldn't have received anything at all. While Hendrik's brother had spent years working in the forge to uphold the family name, Roman had been indulging in women and frivolities in the streets, doing nothing. In Hendrik's eyes, the biggest trash in the shop wasn't the equipment, it was Roman himself. Roman, aware of the tension, calmly replied that he understood Hendrik's anger. However, what he wanted to know was why the sword in his hand had been hammered so much that it had changed color when placed under the sun. That kind of discoloration could only be caused by an inexperienced blacksmith who didn't know how to strike metal properly. This sword, Roman pointed out, was not up to Dimitri standards, and Hendrik couldn't deny it. Roman demonstrated with the sword, explaining how one of his soldiers had died on the battlefield because this sword couldn't pierce flesh. Another soldier had the blade get stuck in the enemy's muscle, leading to his death. Roman asked if that wasn't an injustice. The soldier did his best on the battlefield but died like trash because he had been armed with trash. Hendrik still didn't seem to grasp where Roman was going with this. Roman picked up a chainmail from the ground and questioned whether this flimsy piece of armor was what they called protection. It wouldn't even withstand a single blow, and the weight distribution was all wrong. Soldiers trusting their lives to this would die on the battlefield, their organs torn apart. Hendrik remained indignant, demanding to know what nonsense Roman was spouting. Roman asked if Hendrik really didn't understand. Roman could sympathize with Hendrik's frustration. After all, he had just shown up out of nowhere and started criticizing the equipment. Roman was willing to accept those emotions. However, Hendrik had crossed the line. If Roman had taken this pile of trash and armed his soldiers with it, they would have died. Hendrik's personal feelings had no place in a matter that involved 30 lives. Even knowing this, Hendrik had hidden the truth. Roman asked whether a man who would let 30 innocent people die for the sake of his pride could truly be called a craftsman worthy of representing the Dimitri family. By putting his feelings above the lives of soldiers, Hendrik had committed insubordination, not just against Roman, but against his father's name, which was at stake in this request. Roman tells Hendrik that he understands he's not acting deliberately, but he needs to grasp the consequences of his actions. This wasn't a personal request, it was an order from Lord Dimitri to provide high-quality weapons and armor. Roman knows that hierarchy must always remain clear, even with loyal people and friends. The moment anyone crosses the established boundaries, they must be punished severely. He asks once more if this can be seen as insubordination. Hendrik replies that it isn't, and Roman then questions why Hendrik tried to deliver such subpar equipment. At that moment, other blacksmiths start to gather, cursing Roman for humiliating Hendrik. They demand to know what Roman plans to do, especially with the sword in his hand, and order him to be stopped. However, Hendrik commands everyone to stand down. One blacksmith asks why, but Hendrik just shouts at them. He then turns to Roman and apologizes, admitting that he is entirely to blame for this situation. Hendrik recalls a time when he was beaten by his own master for trying to forge his own swords. His master warned him that he never set foot in the forge again if he continued down that path. Later at home, enraged at the unjust treatment, Hendrik thought of his master as nothing more than a pig who taught him nothing and only beat him every day. During that time, Hendrik overheard a poor man begging his master for any sword, even a low-quality one, offering to repay much more once he achieved his goals. The man was unhealthy and needed a weapon to survive, but the master refused and ordered him to leave. Hendrik, feeling sympathy, followed the man and offered him a sword he was going to discard. The man, overwhelmed with gratitude, thanked Hendrik, who for the first time felt proud to help someone. However, his joy was short-lived. Hendrik later found the man dead on the ground, covered in flies. People commented that he had died during a mercenary mission, and when he tried to defend himself, his sword broke. The tragedy made it clear: only go to battle with a good weapon. For Hendrik, that event was like losing a part of himself, and he swore that he would never let something like that happen again. Now, standing before Roman, Hendrik feels the same shame. He apologizes once more and says he will take full responsibility for his actions. Roman, acknowledging Hendrik's willingness to take responsibility, decides not to pursue the matter further. He drops the sword and tells Hendrik that he knows he's one of the best blacksmiths, and they need to talk business. Roman explains he came for the equipment for his soldiers and believes Hendrik's disobedience was driven by emotion. Roman suggests that with this, they can bury both their mistakes and move forward. All he wants is weapons and armor, nothing more. Hendrik realizes that Roman has given him a way out without severe punishment. What puzzles him is how much Roman has changed in such a short time. He's not the same person Hendrik once knew. Hendrik swears that he will never make this mistake again, and offers to make the equipment with the best iron the Dimitri family has. He orders everyone to return to work, and production begins. As a man sharpens a sword nearby, Roman asks about the rumor that he once stole a sword from Hendrik. The man explains that 3 years ago, Roman was drowning in debt, and his father had stopped giving him money. In desperation, Roman snuck into the forge and stole Hendrik's masterpiece, a sword that took 6 months to design and another 3 months to forge, with Hendrik never leaving the workshop during that time. Despite its immense value, Roman sold it to some random person for a small sum of money. The man tells Roman he could never understand the pain of losing a masterpiece, especially without it finding its rightful owner. Roman realizes that his past self had indeed crossed the line. Hendrik then calls Roman over and says that although he is honoring the request due to his earlier mistake, he still doesn't forgive Roman. He cannot accept a Dimitri who knows nothing about blacksmithing. Hendrik reminds Roman that the foundation of the Dimitri family is the forge, and if Roman ever creates something that isn't trash, Hendrik will reconsider his view. Roman confidently responds that it won't take long. Roman returns to the secluded room where he trains his skeletal body. Everything is meticulously organized as he requested, and all the tools are in place. It's time to start forging again. It was at the age of 18 when Roman decided to forge his own blade. Back then, while others were fighting to be named the successor of the demon cult, Roman was constantly attacked by his brothers. One night, number 11 ambushed him, nearly killing him. Roman barely survived, but his sword couldn't withstand the assault. Despite his injuries, his brother gave him no chance to escape. Roman somehow managed to win that duel with a broken blade, but only narrowly escaped death. That's when he realized he needed a sword forged specifically for him. From that moment on, he visited blacksmiths daily to learn the craft of forging. Before every decisive battle, Roman forged a new sword. With each battle, the sword evolved little by little, until his 39th creation, which he named the Celestial Demon's Sword, a treasure so rare that it couldn't be sold at any price. Now, as war looms once again, Roman prepares to forge a new sword for his current self. Roman began his work, repeating the actions he had mastered thousands of times. He understood the rhythm, strength, and concentration needed to focus on a single objective. To forge something like this required him to enter a trance-like state. As he worked, he questioned what he was truly living for in this world. Born as the son of the celestial demon, battles were inevitable for him, but he had never viewed that as a burden. His mind was calm now, and he accepted his reality. However, this didn't mean he had to fight against everyone. It only showed that his training needed to be even more rigorous, proving he still had no understanding of the most powerful forces in this world. For him, defeat was unacceptable. He exhaled a breath of flames, using the art of the infernal demon, a technique that converted all accumulated chi into heat. Although not the most powerful technique, it was the only one his current self could handle. He couldn't forge too many things, as it could damage his organs, but he desired a power that could face all possible threats. Meanwhile, at the Lawrence mansion, Flora discussed their dire situation. They were trapped, cut off from outside aid, and the military disparity was stark. A debate began about whether surrendering to preserve what little land they had left was the best option. However, Flora believed that surrender was the one thing they absolutely must not do. Suddenly, Lawrence slammed the table, stating that preserving the soldiers' lives was the best course in this war. But Flora countered, pointing out that the Barcos had borrowed a significant amount of money from the central government. Everyone knew it was a high-interest loan, taken without collateral, meaning the interest rate was exorbitant. The Barcos weren't the only ones benefiting from the war. The bank that lent the money expected expected to claim part of the conquered land as repayment. This meant that if they surrendered, the land would be consumed entirely once occupied. The room fell silent as everyone realized that surrender wasn't an option. Flora's father asked what they should do, and Flora stated there was only one path forward. They had to resist, no matter what. Desperate resistance was their only hope for survival. Her father slammed the table again, frustrated by what he saw as common sense. He had hoped she would offer a brilliant plan, something far more strategic. He sarcastically asked if her great plan was to close the gates. Flora, unshaken, explained that they weren't going to hide. Instead, they had to burn all their crops and stockpile as much food as possible to withstand a siege until winter. Her father, confused, asked why winter was so important. Flora explained that winter would buy them time, during which the interest on the Barco's loans would accumulate. The gold bank, which had massive influence across the continent, would start pressuring the Barcos to end the war quickly. This wouldn't happen due to the central government's connection with the gold bank, but because the bank would hire mercenaries, who were motivated solely by money. Once winter hit, maintaining control over a castle would become a liability, and the mercenaries would likely abandon the siege. The people began to murmur that it could indeed turn into a battle of time. It wasn't the most favorable plan, but it was plausible. Lawrence, thinking about how much Flora had matured, slammed the table once more and agreed. They would begin preparing for desperate resistance, determined to survive and preserve the Lawrence lineage. Even if the walls fell and the castle was destroyed, they would continue to fight for survival. Meanwhile, back with Roman, the first sword was finally ready. He reflected that the first time doing anything is always special. This sword was the first he had forged in this life, a blade that perfectly matched who he had become. He decided to name it Salamandra, borrowing the name from this world. The scene shifts to a man approaching from the walls of Lawrence Castle, carrying the Barco family's crest. The soldiers on the wall were visibly frightened. The man announced that as a messenger of the Barcos, he brought three options. The first was to lower the gates and surrender, in which case their lives would be spared. The second option was to leave the walls and engage in a fair fight on the battlefield. There would be a judge from the central government, and they could select 2 knights to participate, choosing the type of battle. The Barcos would abide by their decision. Watching from a distance, remarked that the Barcos couldn't be trusted. The war proclamation wasn't justified, as the ancestral document had been forged. He added that there was no intention of sacrificing the lives of the Lawrence people. While Viscount Lawrence stated that he would never surrender, the soldiers discussed the last option: to abandon their pride as nobles and commit to a desperate resistance within the castle. The messenger turned and said that the Barco family understood their decision and would exact a price for the blood that would be shed during the siege. On the wall, the soldiers trembled, and Lawrence felt fear grip him. The war had already begun. He immediately ordered the archers to fire. The first volley of arrows flew, and the army began advancing. It was classic medieval warfare, with soldiers engaging face to face. Meanwhile, a Barco soldier threw his helmet to the ground in frustration. Furious, he cursed the insolence of the Lawrence family for not surrendering. They had prepared 3 times more soldiers, so why weren't the Lawrences giving in? Another soldier had expected the battle to be over within an hour, but the reality was different. Lawrence seemed prepared for a prolonged fight. The enemy had fortified the entire wall and maintained access to the river, making it impossible for the Barco soldiers to approach. From the sheer number of arrows fired, it was evident that the Lawrences had enough war supplies to last. The Barco leader couldn't comprehend why the Lawrences were so determined to resist, especially since they had calculated everything perfectly to ensure surrender within a week. The knight asked the Lord what they should do next. The Lord replied that they would use that. The knight trembled but understood. The Barco lord smiled, noting that Lawrence wasn't a man with a strong mind. After all, he had sold his daughter to the Dimitri family under pressure from the Barcos. He believed Lawrence was the type of man who would crumble under a crisis. However, on the wall, Lawrence was shouting orders, telling everyone to prepare again, as it was impossible to know when the Barcos would attack next. He then turned to Flora, admitting she had been right. The Barcos had attacked only to force a surrender, but when they saw the resistance, they retreated. Flora replied that she had realized something important. She couldn't wait for problems to be solved for her. She had to become stronger. This was the path she had chosen in life from now on. Her father, moved by her determination, apologized for forcing her to marry into the Dimitri family. At the time, he believed it was their only chance to survive. However, from now on, he would trust that she could make the right decisions on her own. Flora was emotional but composed. Suddenly, the wall in front of them exploded. A single attack had torn apart the front section. Flora rushed to see what had caused it. To her horror, the Barcos had deployed a catapult armed with a magical weapon known as flare. It was a well-known item in wars. Each shot from the flare was extremely expensive and had to be used strategically. Moreover, its use required government permission, regardless of how much money one had. Flora never imagined that the Barcos would have the resources and connections to obtain such a weapon. The worst part was that there were only two ways to defeat a flare. Either they had to use another magical weapon of the same rank, or they would have to leave the castle and destroy it. Both options were impossible for the Lawrences. Despite this, they refused to give up. At that moment, a maid announced that they had received a magical message. Such a communication method was not only extremely rare but also very expensive. The message was from Roman Dimitri, who said he had a way to help them and urged Flora to accept his offer. Flora was left wondering why Roman Dimitri was getting involved in this conflict. The scene then shifts to Flora asking Roman how he plans to save the Lawrences from danger. Roman clarifies that his involvement is purely to get revenge on the Barcos for personal reasons, something he had already decided on. This was the perfect time for revenge, and if the Lawrences followed his plan, he would actively participate and destroy the Barco family for them. Flora asks what they would need to do as part of the plan. Roman replies that the Lawrences must first create a stage for him by making a certain sacrifice. If they did this, with all the forces he had, Roman Dimitri would assist them. Flora understood that his proposal stemmed from the dire situation they were in, and she had no other choice. Determined to protect her family, she says she will do whatever is required. Roman adds that he needs one more thing, a reason to get involved in this war. Since the engagement had been cancelled, he needed something else. Flora asks what he requires, and Roman tells her to publicly claim that Anthony Barco abused her during one of their meetings. That would be the reason she couldn't go through with the marriage. If this was revealed, her value as a noblewoman would be ruined, and the prestige of her title as the flower of the Lawrences would be destroyed. However, by sacrificing all that came with her noble birth, she would gain a critical cause that would allow Roman to intervene in the war. Flora trembled at the thought. Roman explained that if this accusation had been made before the engagement was cancelled, it would have been enough justification for him to act, since it would mean Anthony Barco had laid hands on someone who belonged to him. Roman made it clear that he would never forgive such an offense. Flora reflected on Roman's words about people who belonged to him. While explosions continued to rock the castle, soldiers were screaming, the walls were crumbling, and they were in desperate need of support. With a trembling voice, she agreed to his conditions and asked him to kill all those Barco bastards. The enemy began scaling the walls, and Lawrence gave the order for the soldiers to defend and keep resisting. At that moment, a hooded man lunged to take Lawrence's life. Realizing he couldn't dodge in time, Lawrence braced for the end, but the man was struck in the face. Flora had shot an arrow. Her father turned, shocked, and asked what she was doing there, but she simply said that they needed to open the gates and face the Barcos head-on. Lawrence, bewildered, asked why. Flora explained that Roman had promised to help them, and once the troops entered the castle, they would destroy the flare. Her father questioned why Dimitri had changed his mind, but Flora insisted there was no time to explain, only that she was certain Roman was a man who kept his word. Meanwhile, in the forest, Roman was observing a magic crystal when Chris approached and asked if they were going to attack. Roman, however, said they would not. Chris pointed out that at this rate, the Lawrences would be defeated before they could get involved. The flare was an incredibly powerful weapon that would destroy the castle walls, and they needed to act now. But Roman coldly asked why he should care. Whether the Lawrences fell or not was irrelevant to him. Roman explained to Chris that among the deaths of hundreds of people, ensuring that none of his people shed blood was far more important. The Lawrences would lose many lives because they followed a lord who lacked the capability to protect them. However, those who followed Roman would never become meaningless sacrifices. Chris acknowledged his understanding, though he couldn't fathom how Roman could make such a choice. Back at the castle, the Lawrences gave the order to open the gates and command their soldiers to move forward. The army from the ships began pouring into the castle, where the Lawrences awaited them. A man with a red beard, part of the Burge mercenary company, sneered, mocking the Lawrences for not knowing their place. With one slash, he split a poor soldier in two. The first man to fall was already screaming and begging for help as the mercenary troops advanced, but everyone knew they were marching to their deaths. From the walls, Flora continued issuing orders, telling them to resist until the very end and not retreat. She knew that if they didn't serve as the bait, Roman wouldn't appear. Suddenly, the sound of hooves echoed across the battlefield. Someone was approaching from the rear of the base. The leader demanded to know who they were, and, as expected, it was Roman's personal cavalry arriving. For Roman, the moment for the soldiers to risk their lives had come too soon. He knew that most of them were insecure and anxious, but this was the reality they had to face. He promised that whoever survived would live the life of a predator, but in the end, it was each person's individual skill that would determine who survived. Roman warned everyone that their priority was to reach the base of the ships and destroy the siege weapon. He knew the Lawrences would be insufficient to create a good distraction, and he didn't expect much from the soldiers either. That's why he decided to lead the vanguard himself. He planned to massacre everyone in front of him, clearing the path for his soldiers to handle the rest. But they had to remember, the priority was destroying the siege weapon. The Barco captain saw the approaching soldiers and thought they were fools, thinking they could win with so few men. He warned his knights to prepare for battle, but Roman charged head-on, leading his troops. He raised his blade and tore through the first line of defense. Roman's horse was killed, but the Murim world followed one strict rule. The celestial demon was always at the forefront of the demonic cult. As the leader, he was expected to be invincible. Facing him meant certain death. Despite Roman's importance, he always took the most dangerous position because his presence crushed the enemy's morale. Roman declared that if no one stepped forward, he would wipe them all out. Kevin then shouted for everyone to follow their leader, and they went on a rampage. Kevin's horse was struck, which only fueled his rage, driving him to kill the enemy in front of him to keep up with Roman. Chris remained focused, intent on staying close to Roman for support. The enemy soldiers formed a barricade to stop what they saw as a monster, but they stood no chance. Roman knew the mission's target, the weapon known as flare. It was something unfamiliar in the Murim world. The leader of the mercenaries, Burge, recognized Roman Dimitri. He understood that his mercenaries would receive a massive reward for completing the mission, but he realized that he would have to face Roman personally. Burge was an Oron knight, at least a 2-star warrior who could use mana. However, he was shocked to see Roman not retreating for even a second under his attack. Roman's blade was surrounded by a purple energy as he struck Burge with full force. Though Burge tried to defend, Roman was too strong. Burge began retreating, but the slash went through his defense, and in just 5 seconds, the mighty mercenary fell to his knees. That was the amount of time Burge, a ranked mercenary, could resist against Roman. The enemies were terrified as they saw their captain fall, while Roman's allies were ecstatic. The leader of the ships ordered his men to kill Roman, but they hesitated, knowing it was too dangerous. Roman was curious about flare, a magical weapon that didn't exist in the Murim world. Activating the art of the heavenly demon, Roman used the first form of his sword technique and tore flare in half. The soldiers on the ships were now hopeless, realizing the expensive weapon they brought had been destroyed. Roman called out to the Lawrences, telling them that he had destroyed the Barco siege weapon. From the wall, the people were cheering, but no one was more emotional than Flora, overwhelmed by the sight of their victory. It was clear that with the destruction of flare, the Barcos had no choice but to retreat. During the battle, Chris had used his aura differently from before. Instead of trying to make the energy explode, he attempted to condense it, similar to Roman. Some of his friends had ridiculed him for leaving everything behind to follow Roman, but unlike them, Chris was growing stronger. He couldn't deny it anymore. Roman's method was the correct one. However, confusion set in. Chris's friends were all lying on the ground, exhausted, yet not one of the 30 men had been injured. It was incredible. The 30 people Roman had chosen were the right ones, and the only reason they were all safe was that Roman had defied logic by leading the charge. Roman approached, commending them for surviving and announcing that their role in the battle was over. The gates of Lawrence opened, and the Dimitri army entered the castle. Everyone hailed Roman as the hero who saved all of Lawrence's territory. The Viscount felt ashamed, knowing he hadn't been capable of what Roman had achieved. Roman had single-handedly completed the task and displayed destructive talent. The Viscount realized that if things had gone differently, Roman might have been his son-in-law. It was a pity, but that was in the past. The Viscount called out to Roman, thanking him for his heroism and presence, saying it was a pleasure to see him there. Roman simply smiled and shook his hand while the people cheered. As Roman entered the castle and was about to enter a room, someone asked him to wait. It was Flora. She wanted to thank him for not abandoning them, even though they hadn't fulfilled their role as bait properly. She expressed her gratitude from the bottom of her heart. Roman replied that he had fulfilled his part, as promised, and that the Lawrences had done as much as he expected. Flora insisted she wanted to repay the favor, not just with words. She promised that whatever he needed, she would ensure he received it. Roman smiled and said that if she truly wished to repay the favor, he wouldn't refuse. He then entered the conference room, where the nobles were discussing ending the war with the Barcos. Their plan was to propose peace, fearing further risks. Roman couldn't help but think he was in a room full of herbivores. The Viscount agreed with the proposal, stating that they didn't have the strength to resist the Barcos' attacks any longer. Roman asked if he could speak. Granted permission, he thanked them and explained that the Barcos were under financial pressure. They had to cover the costs of the attack and repay their debts. If Lawrence sent a messenger asking for peace, they would only receive his head in return. The nobles hadn't considered this, but Roman pointed out that the Barcos were cornered and would not retreat. Roman reminded them of the soldiers still outside, carrying bodies, and asked if anyone felt anything witnessing that. He insisted the Barcos should not be forgiven and that this was their chance to show the world what happens to those who attack the Lawrences. The Viscount admitted he understood, but questioned what they would do if they lacked the strength to finish it. Roman explained that there was only one way to defeat them. The Viscount felt cornered, while Roman, seeing the indecision, realized the herbivores had no choice but to become prey to the savage. Meanwhile, on the Barco's side, the captain was shouting, banging on the table, frustrated by Roman Dimitri's involvement in the war. A large-scale attack was now disadvantageous for them. The captain realized there was only one option left, a one-on-one combat. Each family would send a representative, and the central government would appoint a judge to oversee everything, a true duel of warriors. The Viscount remarked that warrior battles had deteriorated due to connections and wealth. The Barcos, despite being affected, still had a lot of money and government ties, making it unpredictable which master they might call to participate. Roman acknowledged the concern and reassured the Viscount, saying that he would provide the certainty he was seeking. The room fell silent, and the Viscount, confused, asked what certainty he would deliver. Roman calmly replied that he would ensure the warriors' battle would be the best option. Roman explained that the Barcos had a 3-star knight, who would likely be the one to fight. He would represent the Lawrences and was confident that he could guarantee at least one victory, regardless of who the Barcos sent. However, the issue was that even if he won one, they could still lose two. That's why their subordinate, Chris, would participate in the final battle. Chris was a genius capable of defeating even a 3-star opponent. If they emerged victorious in this combat, the Lawrence's reputation would be fully restored. Roman looked at Flora and told everyone to make their decision. Flora remembered their conversation before entering the room, realizing this was the favor Roman had wanted to ask. She understood the implications. Roman would take on the responsibility of defending them, but the Lawrences would need to handle any unforeseen consequences. Although she was concerned about where this might lead, sensing the dangerous nature of Roman, she couldn't back out now and voiced her support for the combat. After both parties agreed, everything was arranged for a week later. At the event, a man introduced himself as Count Hers and declared that the warriors' battle was an event blessed by Valhalla. Both sides would act according to the rules, and any breach would result in punishment from the entire kingdom of Ku. He then ordered both sides to submit their list of warriors. At another table, someone poured a glass of wine, and Roman quietly observed the Barco's calm demeanor. He soon noticed something unusual and warned Lawrence that they needed to change the combat order. Lawrence was startled, as everything had been decided a week ago, but Roman pointed out that this past week itself was the issue. The Barcos weren't anxious because they had delayed the event on purpose. Lawrence realized they might have called in a powerful master. Nearby, a man appeared to be passing out from drinking, but Roman sensed something different about him. The Viscount asked what Roman planned to do. Roman had initially planned to win the first battle, lose the second, and have Chris win the final round. But now, he decided to change the plan. He instructed that Chris would go first. Both father and daughter were shocked by this sudden change. Roman explained that he would go second and face the Barco's secret weapon. He was confident this modification would make their victory overwhelming. The audience grew anxious as Chris entered the arena to face his opponent. The man introduced himself as Jensen of the Barcos, a 3-star knight. Chris, in turn, introduced himself as the representative of the Lawrences. The crowd immediately recognized Chris's name, a 2-star knight, and believed they were about to witness the unnecessary death of a talented fighter. But Chris was determined. He knew that risks were necessary for growth, which was why he had left the pit he once belonged to in order to follow his lord. The duel began with a flag being raised. Jensen moved first, launching a mana slash. However, Chris remembered what Roman had taught him during their first duel. Aura is irrelevant until it physically connects with the opponent. As long as he wasn't hit, Jensen's 3-star status meant nothing. Chris kept dodging, waiting for the right opportunity. Jensen grew frustrated, asking how long this would continue dodging, and lunged forward, telling Chris to die. Chris realized that Jensen had spread his aura across the entire field, making it impossible to dodge. But then he remembered Roman's advice, to break free from the logic that others followed. Chris focused on one crucial detail. An explosion of mana meant nothing without a proper direction. The true potential of aura lay in concentrating its power on a single point. As As the final blow approached, Chris concentrated his aura and struck. His aura sliced through Jensen's, severing the knight's arm cleanly. The stump fell to the ground, and the crowd erupted in cheers, chanting Chris's name. To them, it was unreal. A 2-star knight had defeated a 3-star warrior. Roman, meanwhile, simply smiled. The ones trembling were clearly from the Barco's family. Their plan was to end it all in the second fight, but now the final round had become the most crucial. Still, they weren't concerned. They hadn't planned on worrying about the second match, as they had a guarantee in the form of someone they had spent a fortune on. A blue-garbed man yawned as he made his way to the arena, clearly bored. He introduced himself as Hamos, representing the Barcos, a 4-star knight. The audience was stunned. Hamos was a well-known name in the region, currently ranked 49th among the most powerful people on the continent. What was someone like him doing in a small town? The Viscount, now convinced there was no way to win the second fight, realized that everyone in Cairo had heard of Hamos. His reputation as a wandering swordsman who roamed the continent defeating challengers preceded him, and now it seemed the Lawrences were facing an impossible battle. The crowd pitted them. However, Roman, standing calmly, was smiling. He was excited that his opponent was a 4-star knight. Though he had tried to gather information about who the Barcos would send, all he had received were superficial details. Now, standing before him was the hidden trump card of the Barcos, but Roman was eager. Just as they had concealed their strength, the Barcos had no idea how powerful he truly was. Flora, concerned, grabbed Roman's arm and urged him to surrender. His opponent was ranked 49th, and being young, Hamos could easily rise to the top 30. She begged Roman not to dream of defeating someone from the rankings, otherwise he would lose his life. All they could hope for now was to pray for a win in the next fight. Hamos watched on, amused, could tell that this was how someone with absolute confidence looked at others, something he deeply disliked. Flora reminded him that this was the unpredictable situation they had discussed earlier. She insisted on sending one of their soldiers in his place, as there was no reason for him to risk his life in a pointless battle. But Roman gently pulled her hand away, stating that he had no intention of explaining the details and asked her not to bother him further. With determination, he stepped forward and introduced himself on the battlefield as Roman of Dimitri, fighting in defense of the Lawrences. The two knights drew their swords. Hamos, seeing Roman's stance, assumed he was at least a 2-star knight, judging by his destruction of a flare. However, to Hamos, it was absurd to face someone of Roman's level, especially since he was on the cusp of competing for the 30th rank. Deciding to finish the match quickly, Hamos lunged at Roman in a flash, and the soldiers surrounding the arena were shocked by the speed of his movement. Roman defended against the strike, though the blade came dangerously close to his neck. Even as Roman blocked the attack, Hamos was already behind him. Intrigued, Hamos commented on how interesting Roman was. He slashed again, and Roman, condensing all of his mana into his blade, blocked once more. Hamos, curious, asked why Roman was manifesting his aura in such a way. Roman, however, was growing irritated by Hamos' clear underestimation of him. Tiring of the game, Hamos activated his 3-star aura, declaring that he would now fight seriously. His energy generated electricity that spread across the arena, so powerful that the audience had to hold on to their seats. Yet Roman was thrilled. This man was ranked 49th, and Roman saw no reason to drag the battle out any longer. Stepping forward, Roman activated his aura, challenging Hamos to withstand it if he could. He unleashed a technique. The celestial demon techniques had no form, and all Hamos could see was a sudden black wave before him. He had never seen such an attack, let alone one created with mana. Indeed, the attack had no shape, which was why the movements were only known by numbers. This particular one was called the third move. We saw the noble trying to convince the Homos to participate in a duel and give up the fight with Fernando, who ranked 30th. It was his guild leaders saying they would receive a large sum of money if he participated in this duel between two remote families. He thought about it, realizing he had refused all missions since becoming a rank A, so maybe it was worth it, especially since he needed money. He decided not to refuse, but the result was entirely unexpected. Everyone present was speechless. The audience couldn't even comprehend what had just happened. The prodigy from Cairo, who had entered the rankings even before becoming a 4-star, had been killed with a single slash. Roman couldn't understand how someone so far from their peak could be so arrogant. That's because his metrics weren't based on this world, but on the one he came from. Compared to this place, the world of Murim was like a galaxy of martial masters, where no one dared to be arrogant, as death constantly loomed. To Roman, this place was inefficient, and he told the judge to announce the winner of the second combat. Hesitant and stumbling over his words, the judge declared Roman Dimitri, representing the House of Lawrence, as the winner. The crowd was in disbelief, unable to process that the prodigy everyone had talked about was truly dead. To them, it felt like a hallucination. Chris, watching, began to realize the true strength of the lord he followed. He didn't understand if Roman had always been this strong, or if he had undergone some drastic change. Chris had thought the day he would defeat Roman wasn't far off, but that had been pure foolishness. With the flag raised, the House of Lawrence was declared the victor. The last fight became irrelevant, and it didn't matter who was sent. Ares announced that both families could send another warrior. The Barco representative was seething with rage. It was over, but he couldn't comprehend how homos had died. He wasn't just an average knight. To the warriors of the north, he was one of the few true soldiers in the kingdom of Cairo. The representative asked why mercenaries were being sent to fake things, but the Barco representative said they couldn't afford to lose any more strength and ordered them to send Benson instead. The man was shocked. He knew this was revenge for the shame Benson had brought upon them when he was beaten by Dimitri. The problem was that Benson was a knight without stars, meaning he was being sent to die. With no other choice, the man agreed. Benson presented himself on the battlefield, trembling. No one in the audience had ever heard of him, but Chris knew him well. Suddenly, someone stepped in front of Roman. It was Kevin, who announced he would face Benson. Roman knew that in a world where only the strongest survive, losers receive nothing but death. Even though Benson was starless, it would still be difficult for Kevin. Roman understood that Kevin was trying to prove his usefulness, and allowed him to fight. Kevin promised to return soon. On the field, Benson was wondering how he had gotten into this mess. He had chosen to become a knight for the Barcos because his father had done so without issue. That was why he had picked an influential family where he could earn money. Despite this, he had remained loyal, and now they were sending him to die like garbage. Something, however, confused him. He wondered if that boy would be his opponent. His expression shifted, and he thanked God. When they faced each other, Benson couldn't stop laughing, asking Kevin if he had come to seek revenge for some past event. Both had been abandoned by their lords, but Benson felt incredibly lucky in comparison. Kevin simply replied that he was nothing more than a sword that protected his lord. Benson lunged at him, telling him to stop being arrogant. Kevin narrowly dodged the first attack and immediately retaliated, aiming for Benson's neck. Benson managed to pull back just in time and countered with a kick that sent Kevin sprawling across the arena. Kevin's helmet flew off, and he skidded along the ground. Standing up, not in the best condition, Kevin braced himself. Chris realized that the difference in physical strength between the two was vast, as Benson was a grown man. He couldn't fathom what Roman was thinking by allowing Kevin to participate in this duel. Once again, Kevin took a hit to the chest, and only the craftsmanship of his armor saved his arm. Kevin was being humiliated, but gradually, something stirred within him. A voice inside his head told him to kill Benson, the bastard who had hurt him. It was time for revenge. Kevin remembered Roman explaining that from the moment he had cut his hand, the art of a spiritual demon had been implanted in his mind. All he needed to do was unleash this demon, and suddenly, something strange began to happen. A dark aura formed around his body as he was about to take a blow to the head. A mysterious voice told him to look up, and he narrowly dodged the strike. He stood up and faced Benson, while the voice mocked him for almost being cut in half, urging him to tear his opponent apart. Kevin couldn't understand why this voice was screaming at him. All he wanted was to be useful to his lord, more useful than Chris. He hated the feeling of inferiority, and those emotions began to fuel a vortex of rage. This was the art of the spiritual demon. When the voice commanded him to kill Benson, Kevin lunged at him in an instant. Benson immediately recognized that the tip of Kevin's blade was coated in aura and knew it would penetrate his armor. Calling Kevin a bastard, he struck the boy's shoulder with a solid blow, but Kevin didn't back down. Benson couldn't understand why Kevin wasn't retreating. It was as if the boy had lost his mind. The attack went through, and both Chris and the audience were horrified. Kevin seemed to enjoy killing Benson, continuing to strike his body until the battlefield was drenched in blood. Standing in the middle, laughing like a madman, Kevin finally left the arena. He approached Roman, saying he had returned as promised. Roman simply replied that Kevin had done an excellent job. Now, like a jester, Kevin smiled happily. The duel ended with 3 victories for the Lawrences, and at the center of it all was Roman Dimitri. As with all great heroes, stories of this battle began to spread, wrapped in both truth and exaggeration. In the taverns, people gossiped about how the Barcos must have been furious after gathering so many allies only to lose to the Lawrences. Now, many were even claiming to have relatives living with the Lawrences. To everyone, Roman was seen as the savior of those lands. It was said that he had massacred the enemy army and even destroyed the flare with a single attack. Not only had he prevented the Lawrences' defeat, but he had also cut down the 49th ranked knight. To the children of the Lawrence kingdom, Roman had become a hero, and the first tales of the Dragon of Dimitri were beginning to form. The scene then shifted to Barco Castle, where papers were piled high. The Barcos knew it was the end. They They couldn't escape the mountain of loans they had taken out, the interest letters from the gold bank, and the demands from the mercenaries after Homero's death. The Barco leader was furious. Where once the nobles had clamored to be close to the Barcos, now they pretended he didn't exist. He believed none of this would have happened if Roman Dimitri hadn't interfered. To him, it was Roman's fault for doing something that defied the rules of aristocracy. Days later, at a meeting, the Barco leader thanked the nobles who had attended and began discussing the future of the North. The others grew impatient, urging him to stop stalling. He then spoke of the Barcos' attack on Lawrence Castle, emphasizing that it had been done for a valid cause, one approved by the government and its judges. He argued that Roman Dimitri had interfered without any legitimate reason, even in the final duel, where none of the Lawrences had participated. Slamming the table, the Barco leader demanded to know the logical reason behind Roman's actions. To him, it would only make sense if the marriage between Roman and the Lawrences had gone through. At that moment, Roman was nothing to the Lawrences, and his actions went against the aristocracy and nobility. The nobles agreed, murmuring that Roman indeed had no cause. The Barco leader smiled, believing this would be enough. His plan was to shift the blame onto the Dimitris, forcing them to pay the debts owed to the gold bank, which would nullify his own. But then a commotion erupted outside, and to his shock, Roman Dimitri himself walked into the meeting. Roman calmly stated that he had heard of the complaints against him, and that's why he had come. Looking the Barco leader in the eye, "If you're excited for the next part, leave a comment, and I'll do my best to bring it to you as soon as possible."